Hi, everybody. Tonight, we embark on a long and winding journey through the forgotten corners of medieval history. Not through the grand halls of kings or the gleaming armor of knights, but through the soot-smudged, toil-worn lives of those who labored in the shadows. This story is about the absolute worst jobs in medieval history. Those roles so grueling, so miserable, and so strange that they're scarcely remembered except in whispers and weary ballads. Yet behind each title, gong farmer, leech collector, plague barrier, there lived a soul, often unseen, their days woven with hardship and moments of quiet resilience. Through 24 tranquil chapters, we will meander through time, exploring not only what these jobs entailed, but the quiet humanity within them. So let us begin our story with a man named Ulrich, a boy once born beneath a crack-thatched roof on the edge of the great walled city of Norcaster. Ulrich's first memory was of cold water, poured from a rusted ladle into a basin of copper dented by years. It splashed down his small fingers as his mother scrubbed his face, her hands rough with work, her voice barely above a whisper. His father, a man of silence and sinew, woke before the sun and returned after it had disappeared, his boots caked with a darkness no rain ever washed away. The smell of him, sharp and earthy, lingered in the corners of their hut, faintly sour, faintly foul. Even as a child, Ulrich knew not to ask. By the time he was 7, he learned what his father did. He followed him one morning, his bare feet pressing the cool, dewy grass as the city gates loomed ahead. No one noticed the child trailing the man whose job no one envied. He stopped only when the stench grew unbearable. His father turned then, looking back with tired eyes, not angry but weary, and gestured silently toward a wooden shed near the walls. There, a long-handled shovel leaned, beside a pair of patched leather gloves and a cart with a sloshing bucket. Gong farming, they called it. Clearing the cesspits, hauling human waste from privies and chamber pots and dumping it beyond the outskirts. The lowest rung of the city's many trades. They were not allowed to live within the main market walls. The people of Norcaster tolerated them as necessary, but treated them as little more than the muck they moved. Some crossed themselves when Ulrich's father passed. Others muttered beneath their breath or tossed refuse near the path in disdain. Still, it was work. Work that kept the family fed, and better than stealing, as his mother would whisper each evening with a smile that tried too hard. Years passed. Ulrich grew, his frame wiry and sun-browned. He stopped feeling the cold when he lifted the lids of privies. He stopped noticing the flies, but he did notice the stories people left behind. In the pits and slops and reek, he saw fragments of life, broken jewelry lost to haste, scribbled notes discarded in anger, the ragged edges of lace that spoke of rushed farewells or nights best forgotten. He learned to read people through their waste, and while others flinched or scorned, Ulrich looked deeper. But his heart remained heavy, not for himself but for what he saw beyond the walls. On market days, he would climb the hill behind the dumping grounds and watch the noble children ride by in cloaks of fur-lined velvet. He watched minstrels tuning lutes by candlelight and merchants laughing with mouths full of honeyed figs. He did not envy their wealth. He envied their freedom, their untouched hands, their noses free from memory. His chance for something different came not by choice, but by a turn of misfortune. In the winter of his 15th year, a pox swept through Norcaster. Not the plague, not yet, but a wasting fever that took the elderly and the young first. His father coughed for days, then no more. The city, frightened and desperate, called for aid, not from physicians, for there were few, but from those used to filth, used to death. Ulrich, now alone, was summoned not to clean but to collect the dead. It was then that he first met Editha, the plague barrier, though the plague had not yet come. She was older, lean and sharp-eyed, her voice like bark cracking in frost. "You're the gong farmer's son," she said when he was brought to the rear of St. Barrow's alley, where bodies lay shrouded in haste. "Good. You already know the smell of rot." Under her tutelage, Ulrich's world shifted again. He had thought no scent worse than the pits, until he lifted the first linen sheet and saw the gray slack face of a child no older than he had once been. Edith did not flinch. She taught him to carry with his legs, not his back, to keep a sprig of lavender tied in cloth near his nose, and to never ever open the mouth of a corpse, for the soul's already gone, and what remains will try to take you with it. They buried the dead in trenches lined with lime, covered quickly, prayers whispered into wind that didn't listen. Each morning brought more bodies, and each night ended with hands too tired to tremble. In time, Ulrich grew quiet like Editha, his eyes older than his years. He stopped returning to the old hut. The city had claimed him now. Yet even among death, life whispered. One day, amid a heap of linen-bound forms, he found a girl still breathing, faint but clear. Her cheeks flushed with fever, her pulse weak but present. Editha said nothing as Ulrich lifted her, carried her to the chapel infirmary, and waited. She would live, and he would remember her eyes, a green like moss after rain. The girl's name was Bryony. She would change everything. But for now, Ulrich returned to the trench, shovel in hand, the earth cold beneath his boots, the sky above quiet in its indifference. His work was filthy, thankless, and hidden. But within it, seeds of something unexpected began to stir. Not hope, not yet, but something close. The second morning after the fevered girl had been found, Ulrich arrived early at the chapel, his boots still damp from the last burial trench he had dug. He sat quietly in the narrow corridor that smelled of soot and candle wax, listening to the muted sounds of the sick, the shifting of linen, a cough here, a moan there, and always the slow shuffle of the infirmary sisters. They moved like shades, their faces covered with cloth soaked in rosemary water, their movements calm and deliberate. He waited. Bryony, the girl, had been given a narrow cot near the end of the row. A faded woolen blanket lay across her, and her chest rose faintly beneath it. Her eyelids fluttered occasionally, as if she were halfway between dreams and darkness. Sister Wilda, the eldest of the caretakers, paused beside him that morning and rested a hand on his shoulder. "She is quiet, but still burning," the sister said, her voice worn smooth by years. "Sometimes the fever breaks in silence, sometimes not at all." Ulrich nodded without a word. There was little he could do. He was not healer nor priest. He was only a boy who had grown into a man among rot and silence, and yet something pulled him there every morning, before the carts, before the digging. He sat in the corner by the door and watched over her as though he could will her to stay. The work waited for no one. Editha found him later that morning behind the stables, sharpening a spade. "Sentimental, are you?" she asked, brushing soot from her cloak. Her hair, once auburn perhaps, was now a tangle of gray bound in a rough knot. "That's how you lose yourself, boy." Ulrich didn't answer. She sighed and leaned against the post beside him. "I once found a child just like her," she murmured, eyes distant. "A boy with cheeks like apples and hands too small to carry even a spoon. I brought him to the sisters. He lived 2 days. She looked at him then, the lines on her face deepening. "We do what we can, but don't carry what you can't keep." The carts were fuller that week. Whether the fever was spreading or the cold had simply crept into too many bones, the bodies piled faster than the graves could take them. Ulrich no longer paused between tasks. His hands moved without instruction, his eyes searching not for survivors, but for the subtle signs that a heart had stopped for good. Sometimes, though, they made mistakes. It was on the 3rd day after Bryony's rescue that they came upon an old woman in a cellar near the South Road. She had been bundled in furs, her cheeks waxy and pale, her lips parted as though whispering secrets to the cobwebs. Editha moved to lift her when Ulrich stepped forward. He knelt, placing 2 fingers to the woman's throat, a faint pulse. "She's alive," he said, and Editha halted. They left her with the sisters too, though Editha said nothing as they walked back toward the carts. Only once they reached the trench did she speak. "You're not a digger anymore," she said. Ulrich looked at her, uncertain. "You've eyes for the living now," she said almost begrudgingly. "Use them." From that day, he was no longer assigned to the trenches. Instead, he was sent ahead of the carts to inspect each body brought in haste. In barns, under stairwells, behind shuttered homes, he was the final check, the thin thread between burial and breath. It was a role of quiet desperation. For everyone he found alive, there were dozens who were not. But those few, haunted him in a different way than the dead ever had. Each life he spared became a whisper in the fabric of his days. Bryony's fever broke on the 5th day. He found her awake, eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling beams. When she turned to him, there was no fear in her expression, only confusion and a faint sadness that spoke of a girl who had seen too much, even before the sickness came. "You're the one who found me," she said, her voice hoarse. Ulrich nodded. You weren't meant for the trench. She smiled faintly. Am I meant for anything else? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Bronnie's recovery was slow. She walked the halls of the chapel in thick wool slippers, leaning on Sister Wilder's arm when her legs trembled. She watched the world outside the narrow windows with a gaze full of questions she never asked aloud. And Ulrich, between his rounds and reports, returned each evening to sit nearby and listen to her silences. She told him eventually that her parents had died in the first frost. Her brother, a stonemason's apprentice, vanished during the fever. No one had come looking for her. I was always quiet, she said one night, even before I became invisible. He knew what that was like. They became something unspoken to each other. Not quite friends, not yet anything more. But when he returned from his rounds, he found her waiting. And when she walked the chapel corridors, she searched for his shadow. By the time spring hinted at its return, the city streets had begun to stir again. Markets opened, slowly at first, and carts returned to their usual clatter. But beneath the surface, unease remained. Whispers of illness in other towns, of strange boils and blackened limbs. Editha said nothing, but Ulrich saw her sharpening her spades with more care than usual. He stood by the wall one evening, watching the sun melt into the hills beyond Norcaster. Bronnie stood beside him, her scarf drawn close against the wind. Do you ever wish you'd been born somewhere else? She asked. He thought for a moment. No, just differently. She smiled. That's an honest answer. As they stood there, quiet beneath the amber light, a bell began to toll from the lower quarter. Not the chapel bell, a deeper sound, slower, like the heartbeat of something ancient waking from slumber. Ulrich turned to her. That's the plague bell. Brianni's face paled, and the world of the living and the dead, already thin in places, began to stretch once more. The toll of the plague bell did not stop with one chime. It rang again, then again, a measured rhythm meant not to alarm, but to signal. In Norcaster, it was a sound learned young, a sound that meant something unseen had arrived. Ulrich and Bryony stood by the wall without speaking, the last warmth of sun now gone from their cheeks. A wind rose across the fields beyond the gate, and with it came the subtle shift in the air that every city dweller instinctively understood. Something was changing. That evening, the chapel fell into a hush even deeper than usual. The sisters moved quickly, collecting herbs, boiling linens, and lighting blessed candles whose wax dripped slow and golden. A screen was drawn across the infirmary's inner rooms, and no one passed beyond it without the thick cloth of a rosemary-soaked veil tied beneath their chin. Ulrich was summoned not to dig, but to watch. He was told to walk the outer wards, to observe those brought in haste, to watch for symptoms, swelling behind the ears, blackened sores, the stench that no soap could mask. It was Editha who confirmed it 2 nights later. She returned from a farmstead outside the south wall, her gloves stained and her face set like iron. A family of 6, she said, setting down her tools. 3 already dead, the rest not far behind. It's come. The Black Death. The city had heard of it, of course. Merchants from the port spoke in whispers of entire towns emptied, of ships adrift with no crew left breathing. But Norcaster was landlocked, distant from sea winds and foreign tongues. There had been a quiet hope, unspoken and naive, that it might be spared. Now, the hope had dissolved. The Council of Norcaster, a circle of aldermen and clergy, held emergency meetings in the stone chamber beneath the tower. Orders were passed down swiftly. Quarantine zones were drawn across the poorest quarters. Market days were reduced. No traveler from outside was allowed within the walls without inspection, and a curfew was whispered into law before being nailed onto doorposts. Ulrich found himself called more often than ever, not just to identify the living from the dead, but to carry news, to pass between zones, to record. His knowledge of the streets of every alley and corner had become invaluable. Where most men shrank from the task, he moved with a practiced eye. He wore gloves now, and a mask stitched with lavender and sage leaves. Still, the smell crept through. Nothing could hide it entirely. Brianni asked him not to go. She waited for him each evening, standing in the chapel's doorway like a shadow at dusk. Her color had returned, her strength with it, but her eyes held a constant worry. I don't want you to vanish like my brother, she said one night, voice low. I have to go, Ulrich replied gently. They trust me. Because you've walked in filth, she said bitterly. Because they think you've nothing left to lose. He didn't answer. She was right. One morning, as frost still clung to the stones, Ulrich was called to the upper ward. A merchant family had reported a servant girl with fever. He arrived alone, carrying only his ledger and a worn wooden staff to test doors before entering. The home was too quiet. The air inside was close, as though nothing had moved for hours. He found the girl in the scullery, her body twisted near the hearth. No fire had been lit. She was cold. Her hands were stained, her mouth slightly open. Flies moved lazily around her. He checked for breath, for the faintest pulse, but there was none. He made the sign over her chest and stood. Then he heard it, a rustle from the upper floor. He paused, hand on the stair rail, listening. It came again, the faint creak of floorboards. Ulrich ascended slowly, each step careful. At the top landing, he found the master of the house sitting against the wall, clutching a cloth soaked with blood. His eyes were glazed, his skin pale. She died yesterday, the man rasped. We locked her below. Thought maybe it would pass. Ulrich knelt beside him, offering a sip from his flask. The man swallowed with difficulty. I didn't want her to die alone, he whispered, tears tracking silently down his cheeks. But I couldn't go near. Ulrich stayed until the man's breath faded, steady and slow, into stillness. He recorded the names, marked the door with lime, and returned to the chapel long past dusk. Briani met him there. She said nothing, only brought a cloth and washed his hands with steeped herbs. They sat together in silence, the distance between them thinning. Days passed, then weeks. The plague spread like ink in water, quiet at first, then sudden and all-consuming. Entire households vanished. The city's bells rang not for mourning anymore, but as warning. Editha trained new buriers, young men and women whose lives had unraveled with the illness, who now turned to the only work that remained. She was harsh, but not cruel. Her eyes found Ulrich one evening as he filed another report near the chapel. You're not a boy anymore, she said, nor just a digger. Ulrich looked up. What am I then? Her smile was tired but real, a witness, and perhaps that was what he had become. A witness to suffering, to resilience, to fear, and to the few moments of kindness that broke through like sunlight between clouds. He recorded the dead not as numbers, but as names. He remembered faces. He told Brioni their stories, one by one, until she knew the people of Norcaster as if they were kin. One night, as they sat beside the chapel hearth, Brioni placed her hand atop his. You're carrying so many souls, she said. Let me carry some. He did not pull away. Outside, the wind howled across empty streets, and the stars blinked above a city quietly holding its breath. The winds of Norcaster grew colder as spring gave way to an uneasy summer. Where once the air might have carried the scent of ripening fruit and fresh hay, it now bore the faint bitterness of smoke and lime. The city gates, once open to traders and tinkers, remained barred. Guards stood not in welcome, but in wary silence, their eyes hollow behind crude masks and fraying cloaks. The plague had not slowed, it had deepened. Ulrich's days blurred into each other. He rose before the sun, his breath visible in the half-light, and walked his routes through the silence. Each street had its own rhythm of sorrow. On Hollow Lane, a candle was lit in every window. On Pigwell Row, silence fell thick and total. And in the Green Quarter, they had begun to burn the linens of the dead in iron barrels that glowed orange long into the night. His work grew heavier. The city council, unable to keep up with the tide of death, ordered common graves to be widened. The ground behind the chapel, once sacred, now bore the weight of dozens, sometimes more. Editha oversaw the digging, her hands cracked and her eyes rimmed in red. She no longer spoke unless she had to. When she did, it was to correct a grip, adjust a cart, or mark a name in chalk on a plank beside the trench. Ulrich moved between duties. He checked for life where others feared to look, comforted the dying when no priest dared approach, and marked the names of the forgotten in the ledger he carried at his side. At night, he sat with Brioni beside the chapel fire, their silence no longer strained, but shared. Brioni had found work too. With the infirmary sisters overwhelmed, she had offered her hands where they were most needed. She changed linens, bathed the fevered, and soothed the dying with songs from her childhood, soft, wordless things that seemed to calm the air. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth torn from her old cloak and wore a mask soaked in myrtle oil. They seldom spoke of the fear. One evening, after a day heavy with burials, Ulrich returned to the chapel late. His boots dragged and his eyes ached from smoke and sun. He found Bryony seated on the step outside, her hands folded in her lap. A single candle burned beside her. "There was a boy today," she said as he approached, not looking up. "His name was Thomas. He was 6. Ulrich sat beside her. He asked if his mother would be waiting for him, she whispered. They watched the candle flicker between them, its light too small for the dark. "I told him yes," she said, voice tight. "I told him she would be there." "You did right," Ulrich murmured. She looked at him then. "Even if she wasn't?" He didn't answer. That night they remained outside long after the candle had died. In the following days, the sky over Norcaster turned a strange shade of pale. The air hung with a haze that dulled the sun and gave everything the hue of old parchment. Superstition grew. Some blamed the dead, others the foreign merchants long since vanished. Priests and healers argued over omens and divine judgment. One man wandered the marketplace in a sackcloth robe, proclaiming the end of days until he collapsed from thirst and was quietly carried away. Ulrich and Bryony ignored the rumors. They had no time for signs, but one evening the signs came to them. It began with a knock at the chapel gate. Sister Wilda opened it to find a small boy, perhaps 9 or 10, standing barefoot and alone. He held a letter, crumpled and smeared with wax, addressed to the chapel by name. No one had seen who sent him. The letter was short. A noble family in the Eastern Manor quarter was sick. 6 in the household, 3 already unconscious. They had locked the gates and barred the doors. The letter begged for mercy, not just medicine. Ulrich volunteered. So did Bryony. Sister Wilda protested, but Bryony stood firm. "We go where others cannot," she said softly. They prepared carefully. Bryony packed bundles of dried herbs, vials of vinegar and sage oil. Ulrich carried his stask and ledger. Together they left the chapel as dusk settled over Norcaster, the streets quiet save for the distant cry of crows. The manor was tall, with stone towers and ivy-choked windows. A once polished gate now sagged, bolted from the inside. Ulrich pounded the wood 3 times with his staff before a window above creaked open. A servant leaned out, pale and trembling. "Don't come in," she called weakly. "You can't help them." "We can try," Bryony replied. It took time, but they convinced her. The gate opened with a groan. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of death and damp velvet. Bryony pressed a cloth to her face. Ulrich felt his breath shorten, but he moved forward. They found the family in the upper rooms. The father lay motionless on a chaise, his limbs swollen and blackened. The mother moaned softly, her fingers twitching. 2 daughters shared a bed, their faces nearly identical in sickness. A boy, the youngest, sat on the floor beside the hearth, staring at nothing. Bryony knelt beside him. "What's your name?" "Julin," he whispered. "I didn't get sick." She touched his forehead. "Cool." They stayed the night. Bryony tended to the daughters, wiping their foreheads and coaxing them to drink. Ulrich sat beside the mother, feeding her tincture by drop. The house creaked and shifted like an old ship adrift. Shadows moved in the corners, but they ignored them. At dawn, the father passed. Bryony closed his eyes with her fingers, whispering something Ulrich couldn't hear. The daughters stirred, and for a moment, he thought they might survive. Then the elder one coughed. A wet, sharp sound. Blood stained the blanket. They remained 2 more days, doing all they could. When they left, Julin walked between them, holding Bryony's hand. The manor gates closed behind them with a hollow echo. As they returned to the chapel, the street seemed quieter than before. Ulrich looked down at the boy beside them and wondered how much a child could carry before he forgot what it was to be young. Bryony glanced at him and said, "We save who we can." And though neither of them said it aloud, both wondered how long they could keep saving others before they could no longer save themselves. Julin slept in the back chapel that first night, curled beneath a woolen blanket that smelled faintly of thyme and ash. Bryony sat near him, one hand resting gently against the curve of his back, as if to anchor him in place, as if sleep might carry him off somewhere unreachable. Ulrich watched from the archway. The candlelight flickered against the stone walls, and shadows stretched high like faded saints. The boy did not cry. That was the most unsettling part. He had lost his parents, his sisters, everything familiar, yet his face remained unreadable. Only his silence hinted at the depth of what churned beneath. By morning, Sister Wilda arranged for him to share space with two other orphans housed in the sacristy. But Julin did not stray far from Briani. Wherever she went, be it to the infirmary halls or to fetch linen from the store, he followed a step behind, speaking little, observing everything. When Brownie worked, he sat nearby. When she paused to rest, he nestled beside her like a shadow given form. Ulrich found it difficult to look at him for long. Something in the boy's eyes, too still, too old, unsettled him in a way no corpse ever had. The days passed, each one lined with new duties and heavier silences. The chapel became a corridor of comings and goings, the sick, the dying, and those who still clung to a hope that had grown thin as paper. Ulrich's journal thickened with names. Briani's hands grew raw from boiling cloth and tending to broken skin. Neither complained. Word reached them that the western quarter of Norcaster had fallen to chaos. Entire blocks abandoned. Those still well enough to flee had done so under cover of darkness, leaving shutters wide and doors swinging on their hinges. Rumors swirled, of desperate men looting homes, of a priest who refused to bury the dead unless paid in silver, of a woman who claimed to see angels above the riverbanks each morning at dawn. Ulrich was sent that way on a Thursday, alone. He walked carefully, his tapping the stone with each step, his breath steady behind the cloth of his mask. The streets were eerily quiet. Banners still hung from windows long empty. A doll lay in the gutter, its face cracked, one eye gone. A cat watched him from a rooftop, unmoving. He found the house near Stone Lane, as directed, a 2-story home with shutters still drawn. The door creaked open when he knocked, and the smell told him all he needed. Inside, it was dark and still. He lit a candle and moved slowly from room to room. 2 elderly bodies in a shared bed, their fingers intertwined. A third form in the kitchen, kneeling as if in prayer. He paused, knelt, whispered a name aloud that would never be answered, and marked the house in line before moving on. When he returned to the chapel, Briani was outside, seated with Julin beneath the eaves. She looked up and rose, brushing dust from her skirts. "You're safe," she said simply. He nodded. They weren't. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. That evening, after Julin had been led to his cot, Briani and Ulrich sat alone near the garden wall, where elderflowers now bloomed despite the despair. Their scent drifted softly on the breeze. "I've been thinking," Briani said. Her voice had grown quieter in recent weeks, though not weaker. "About what happens next." Ulrich turned to her, puzzled. "Next? When this ends," she said. "If it ends." He hesitated. "You think of that sometimes," she whispered. "Sometimes I imagine walking out of these gates with you, with Julin, going somewhere no one knows our names." Ulrich said nothing. She looked away, her hands folded in her lap. "It's foolish, I know. The sickness hasn't peaked yet. More are falling ill than recovering. But still, when I lie down at night, that thought finds me. I want something beyond this." Ulrich stared out at the darkened city. "I don't know what's left beyond this," he admitted. "But if it exists, I'd go with you." She smiled faintly, not turning her head. A rustle sounded from the chapel behind them. Julin stood in the doorway, blinking sleep from his eyes. Without a word, he crossed the yard and nestled himself between them, resting his head on Briani's side and gripping the edge of Ulrich's sleeve. They remained like that until the candles inside guttered low. In the following weeks, Briani's name began to pass among the sisters. She had a gift, they said. Her hands eased pain. Her presence quieted even the worst fevers. Patients who moaned through the nights grew still when she came near. A priest said she must be touched by the divine. Briani said nothing of it, only continued her work with a steady pace and an unreadable calm. Ulrich watched her grow into something larger than herself. The city leaned into her like vines towards sun. One morning, as he prepared for another round of inspections, Editha pulled him aside. "You've changed," she said, arms crossed. "You've grown into something solid, like a root that won't pull free." Ulrich glanced at the burial cart behind her. "I've had to." She studied him for a long moment. "When this ends, you'll have to decide who you are outside of death. It's not easy. Some of us don't know how to live without it." He didn't answer. That night, as rain fell soft and even on the chapel roof, Ulrich sat by the hearth with Brownie and Julin close beside him. The boy was asleep again, this time with a blanket tucked under his chin, his breathing light and even. Brownie reached across and touched Ulrich's hand. Promise me something, she said. Anything. When it's time, we leave. Together. You, me, and him. He closed his fingers over hers and held them there. In the corner, the flame of a single candle danced quietly against the shadows, casting their three shapes along the stone, one tall, one slight, one small, and still becoming. The rains came in earnest that week, sweeping down from the northern hills in long, unbroken curtains. They turned the roads of Norcaster into sluggish rivers of mud, the gutters into brimming streams that carried leaves, twigs, and remnants of lives once held dear. Bits of cloth, a broken shoe, the corner of a letter smudged beyond reading. The city became quieter beneath the weight of the weather. Doors stayed shut longer, windows fogged. Smoke rose slowly from chimneys that still had warmth to give. Inside the chapel, the air grew close with dampness. The plaster walls wept in the corners, and the woven mats were dark with wet footprints. The sisters burned more herbs now, lavender, rue, marjoram, in brass bowls, the smoke drifting upward in lazy, fragrant spirals. It masked the scent of fever, but not entirely. There was always something beneath it, a hint of skin gone too long without sun, the iron note of dried blood. Julien began to speak again. It happened suddenly, during a moment in the kitchen when Briani dropped a cup and bent to pick up the shards. He watched her for a moment, then whispered, "My sister used to do that." Briani looked up slowly. "Did she?" "She always broke things," he said. "She said it was the house's fault for being too tight." From that day, he spoke more. Not often, and never loudly, but with a calm that felt older than his years. He asked Ulrich where he went during the day, and Briani what time was good for. He liked to sit by the window and watch the rain, his arms wrapped around his knees, his face unreadable. Ulrich found himself growing protective of him. It wasn't a loud feeling, more a constant awareness, a thread that tugged at him gently wherever he went. When he returned from the outer wards, his first glance was always toward the chapel steps, searching for the boy's small shape waiting there. When he didn't see him, his breath caught. The sickness had not relented. If anything, it was burrowing deeper, moving into corners once thought safe. The Merchants Guild lost two of its eldest members in 1 week. The clockmaker, whose hands had once shaped beauty in brass, was found lifeless beside his tools. And the schoolmaster, known for his gentle stammer, was buried with no one to mark his passing but a short line in Ulrich's ledger. Mathis of the Bell Tower, kind, remembered by the baker's son. Ulrich began writing more in the margins. Not just names now, but fragments of who these people had been. A woman who fed birds each morning, even when the seeds grew scarce. A boy who sang to his sister through the walls when they were sick. A man who gave away his last apple to a stranger he never saw again. He filled pages. When one ledger ran out, he bound another himself from scrap parchment and twine. Bryony read them sometimes in the evenings. She sat beside him, her eyes scanning the pages slowly. "They're stories," she said once. "You're writing a book of ghosts." Ulrich looked down at the ink-streaked page. "I just don't want them to be forgotten." "They won't be," she said. "Not if you're the one remembering." The rains continued. Streets flooded. The chapel garden drowned, its herbs washed into the soil, its small footpath now a trickling stream. One night, the roof above the infirmary buckled slightly from the weight of water and had to be patched with boards scavenged from the abandoned mill. Despite it all, the city endured. Fewer carts passed through the streets now, not because the dead had ceased, but because the dead had already come in waves and taken so many. There were fewer to fall sick. And among the survivors, a strange, silent courage began to grow. Neighbors left baskets of broth and bread at doorsteps without waiting to be seen. Windows were open just long enough to let in air and a whisper of song. The bell ringer at the gate tower began playing a tune each dusk, soft, slow, the same melody each night. No one knew its origin, but the city leaned into it, a lullaby for the grieving. One afternoon, Ulrich returned early. He had seen only one body that day, a child already marked with lime by her own mother. He carried no cart, only his ledger and a silence he could not shake. He found Briani in the hallway outside the infirmary, her head resting against the cool stone, her shoulders trembling. He approached slowly. "What is it?" She didn't look at him at first. Then she turned, and he saw her eyes glisten. "It was a girl named Adela," she whispered. "I held her hand while she died." Ulrich placed his hand gently on her back. She told me she was afraid, Brianni continued. Not of dying, of being forgotten. She asked if I would remember her name, just her name. And will you? He asked. I already have, she said. He took her hand then. She didn't resist. They stood like that for a long time. Julien found them later. He was holding a folded piece of parchment. It's from the north gate, he said. Someone's come. The parchment bore a broken seal, a raven stamped in black wax. Ulrich recognized it. The seal of the mountain monks from Raventhorn Abbey, far to the north. They were known for isolation, for silence, for keeping records that stretched back centuries. The note was short. A brother had arrived with word of medicine, an herbal blend said to slow the fever's grip. They were seeking those with steady hands to help prepare it. Ulrich looked to Brianni. Will you go? She looked at Julien, then back at him. We go together. That evening, as the bell ringer played once more above the west wall, the three of them sat beside the chapel fire. Ulrich stitched a new page into his ledger. Brianni crushed dried herbs into linen satchels. Julien traced his finger along the grain of the wooden floor, humming quietly to himself. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, and for the first time in many weeks, a single star pierced the cloud-heavy sky, flickering like a whisper of what might still be waiting beyond the dark. The arrival of the monk from Raventhorn Abbey marked a shift in Norcaster's long and bitter season. He came wrapped in thick gray robes, the hem muddied from his journey, and his hood never left his head, save for brief moments of prayer. His name was Brother Osric, and his voice, when it did emerge, was deep and hollow, like wind moving through stone corridors. Few knew much about him, and he offered no past, no details of his travels, only the bundle of scrolls and satchels he carried with solemn precision. Ulrich met him near the inner courtyard, summoned by Sister Wilda, who now took to walking with a staff and speaking less each day. The monk bowed upon seeing them, his eyes shadowed beneath the folds of his cowl. We come not with cures, Brother Osric said simply, but with aid for the body and a balm for the hours before passing. He laid out his satchels on the stone altar of the old sacristy, each filled with dried herbs, lungwort, comfrey, feverfew, and a pale yellow flower called heartroot, known in his order for its calming properties. There were also instructions, hand-copied in neat Latin, for steeping mixtures, binding poultices, and burning specific combinations for cleansing the air. Brianni was given charge of the preparations. She read the monk's notes by candlelight, her finger tracing each word slowly, lips moving in silent repetition. Though she was no scholar, her mind was quick and her memory sharp. Within days, she had learned the method for steeping the fever blend until it turned the color of weak cider, how to dry the herbs without spoiling the oil within, and which combinations might soothe a cough or calm a fit of delirium. Julien helped grind the dried leaves, his small hands wrapped in cloth to avoid the sting of some roots. He took his work seriously, often humming softly as he turned the mortar in steady circles. Ulrich, meanwhile, was tasked with distribution. He traveled each morning with a satchel of bundles tied in linen and dipped in vinegar. He carried them to the corners of the city, still holding on, where families placed bundles of mint at their windowsills and prayed with more desperation than conviction. He showed them how to steep the tea, when to apply the salve, and how to know when it was too late to try. The people listened, not because they believed salvation had arrived, but because Ulrich did not lie. He never promised healing, only comfort. And in a city dulled by grief, comfort was precious. One morning, he returned to find Brianni seated in the chapel garden, her skirts gathered around her, and a thick manuscript on her lap. The air smelled of marjoram and ash. She looked up and offered a tired smile. I've been thinking about what comes next, she said. Ulrich sat beside her. You've said that before. I think about it more now, she replied. If this medicine helps even a little, we might survive to see the end of this. He looked at her, noting the new hollows beneath her eyes. Do you still want to leave? She nodded. But I don't want to run anymore. I want to build. Somewhere quiet. A place no one remembers until they need it. Ulrich thought of the old forest beyond the southern hills. The mapmaker's stories of glens where the grass grew ankle high and deer moved like ghosts through the trees. We could go there, he said softly. Brianni looked up. We? I already promised, he said. That evening, the three of them sat with Brother Osric as he prepared new parchment for copying. He worked in silence, his movements precise, dipping his quill in thick ink and tracing letters like a man carving stone. Bryony watched him for a time before asking, "Do you ever grow weary of writing the same things?" The monk did not look up. "The words are not mine, they are memory." "And what of your own?" she asked. He paused, then murmured, "I keep them in silence." Ulrich and Bryony exchanged a glance. Some wounds were kept not in scars, but in the refusal to speak. In the weeks that followed, a change began to stir. Slowly, like the thaw of frost in shadowed places, fewer names appeared in Ulrich's ledger. Some recovered. Others did not fall ill at all, though they lived in houses once touched by the plague. Bryony's herbs found their way into kitchens and sick rooms. Brother Osric's blends were passed from hand to hand, his notes copied and translated by the older sisters. Julin was given his own small station in the apothecary room, where he arranged bundles by shape and scent, proud of his precision. Still, none spoke of victory. The plague had taken too much to allow for such arrogance. One morning, a cart arrived from the eastern district, not with bodies, but with letters. Messages from families once thought gone, from friends who had fled and now asked whether it was safe to return. Among them was a folded square of parchment addressed to the chapel, written in a flowing script none recognized. Bryony opened it slowly, reading it aloud. "To those who endured, we are grateful. We are few, but still standing. If your fire still burns, let it be seen. There are others in the hills who search for signs." They lit a fire that night. High on the chapel's roof in the brazier once used for holy festivals, they set kindling and dry cloth aflame. The smoke rose white and slow into the night sky, curling above the rooftops like a silent beacon. Others would see it. Others might answer. And for the first time in many long weeks, Bryony turned to Ulrich and smiled, not with weariness, but with a fragile, flickering hope. "Maybe we're not alone," she whispered. Ulrich looked out across the rooftops, where darkness lay heavy and still, and imagined other fires. Small lights in the distance, each one a promise waiting to be kept. The fire burned through the night, its glow pulsing like a steady breath against the dark spine of Norcaster's rooftops. From the highest tower of the chapel, Ulrich stood watch beside it, feeding the flames with strips of dry oak and the broken remains of pews too warped by damp to be saved. The smoke curled upward, pale and fragrant with resin, a signal, a lantern in a long night. Julin had fallen asleep early, curled at the foot of Bryony's cot. She had wrapped him in her old shawl, one she had worn through the worst of the winter, now thinned and faded but still warm. Her own eyes had grown heavy, but she resisted sleep, watching Ulrich through the tall arched window. Down below, Norcaster remained still. Only a few faint lights glimmered from the merchant quarter. The plague had left so many homes quiet. But in that stillness, something had shifted. Not peace, but a kind of solemn endurance, like soil after fire, barren for a time but rich with potential. At dawn, when the fire finally sank into a bed of glowing coals, Ulrich descended the tower slowly. His arms ached, and his clothes were streaked with soot, but he felt a clarity he had not known in many weeks. The sky was soft gray, not with storm, but with the tentative colors of early summer. Birds called faintly from the eaves, their songs thin but certain. Bryony was waiting at the base of the stairs, her hair loose over her shoulders. "Did anyone see it?" she asked. "Not yet," Ulrich replied, "but they will." That day passed quietly. The sick still came, but fewer than before. Julin helped with the bundles again, and Bryony spent much of the afternoon teaching two of the older children how to prepare a wash of thyme and vinegar for cleaning wounds. Ulrich patrolled the outer wards, checking on families who had begun to open their windows again, who had dared to sweep their steps or hang washed linens out to dry. They did not speak much, but when he passed, they nodded. It was not trust exactly, but it was something close. That evening, just after sunset, the first sign came. A boy, no older than Julin, appeared outside the chapel gate. His cloak was too large, and his shoes mismatched, but his face was clean, and his eyes alert. He carried a stick with white cloth tied to the end, and when Sister Wilda opened the gate, he handed her a parchment with a smile. "From the hill," he said, "they saw your fire." The message was simple. "We are 5, 1 sick, safe for now, will come at moon's rise." Bryony held the letter as though it might fall apart in her hands. 5, she murmured. They're coming. Word spread quickly among the sisters and volunteers. The chapel was made ready, not for the dead, but for the living. Clean cots were laid, food was prepared from dwindling stores, and herbs were steeped not in sorrow, but in anticipation. They arrived just after moonrise, as promised. 2 women, a man, a child barely walking, and a boy of 16 who carried the sick woman on his back. Her eyes fluttered as they entered, her breath shallow but even. She was laid gently on the cot near the rear wall, and Briani moved swiftly, checking her pulse, her skin, the shape of the sores that marred her neck. "She'll survive," she said at last. "She's past the worst." Ulrich brought them bread and weak broth. They ate without speaking, their eyes wide and watchful. The boy who had carried the woman sat close to her side, his hand never leaving hers. Briani watched them for a long while, then went to fetch a wool blanket from the upper hall. Later that night, when the newcomers had all fallen asleep, Briani and Ulrich sat again in the garden, near the cold embers of the morning's fire. 5 more, she said softly. There will be others. Ulrich said. They saw the smoke. She nodded, her eyes distant. And we'll have to make room. We will. He paused, then asked, Do you ever think we'll leave? Briani didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for a fallen blossom beside her, rolling it between her fingers. I used to imagine it every night, she said, but lately, I wonder if we were meant to stay. Ulrich looked up at the stars beginning to appear overhead. To do what? To keep the fire lit, she said, to hold the line, just a little longer. Julian joined them a few moments later, barefoot and drowsy-eyed. He curled beside Briani without speaking, resting his head against her shoulder. She stroked his hair gently, her touch soft and slow. And in that quiet hour they sat as a family not made by blood, but by grief and choice in the quiet threads of survival. The city beyond them breathed in shadows, but here in the chapel's garden, with the scent of elderflower and earth around them, it felt for a time like life was returning. Far off in the hills, another fire flickered. Small, distant, but unmistakable. They watched it burn. The fire on the distant hill glowed like a second moon, steadier than a star, pulsing faintly with the wind. Ulrich, Briani, and Julian watched it until the air grew cold and the night settled thick around their shoulders. No words were spoken. None were needed. It was a sign, and signs were sacred in times when reason had thinned and hope was stitched from fragments. The next morning arrived with an unexpected stillness. The city stirred, but not with fear. The sound of shovels and dirt had become less frequent. No new carts rolled toward the burial fields. No urgent knock sounded at the chapel gate. Instead, there was birdsong, faint, cautious, as though the birds themselves were testing the silence. Brother Osric stood at the chapel's edge, facing the direction of the hill. His cowl was down for once, revealing a narrow face lined with scars and sun. He carried a staff carved with the symbols of his abbey, circles within circles, meant to represent the layering of time, memory, and silence. Briani approached him with a fresh bundle of heartroot. Another fire, she said. He nodded once. They will come? In time, he replied. They always come, slowly. Fear holds them until hunger overrules it. She stood beside him, not speaking for a while. The wind stirred her cloak, lifted the edge of his robe. The chapel bell tolled once in the distance, a soft chime for the morning prayer. They'll need shelter, she said at last. Food, clean water. They'll need grace, Osric added, more than most know how to give. Briani's gaze lingered on the hills. We'll try. Julian was given a new task that day. Sister Wilda, leaning more on her staff now, guided him to the pantry and placed a small slate board in his hands. Count what remains, she said. Flour, lentils, salt. Use chalk, neatly. He worked quietly, mouth moving as he added, erased, adjusted. His handwriting was uneven but earnest. When Ulrich passed by later that morning, he paused to read it. Flour, 2 sacks and 3 fists. Salt, low. Lentils, enough for 6 days if careful. Julian looked up. Should I hide the truth? No, Ulrich said. We need the truth to plan. But if they come hungry, the boy murmured, they might take more than they need. Ulrich crouched beside him. Then we show them how to make it last. That's our task now. Outside, Briani organized the cots in the nave, scrubbing boards that had warped in the rain and laying down new straw. She worked with quiet purpose, each movement precise, measured, no energy wasted. She had become something more than a caretaker now. The sisters followed her lead. The volunteers asked her first. Even the weary-eyed guards who lingered at the chapel gates bowed slightly when she passed. That evening, as the sun folded itself behind the rooftops, the second group arrived. 7 figures, 4 on foot, 2 pulling a makeshift cart and 1 carried. The cart creaked under its burden. An old man with a cloth over his eyes and a rosary wound tightly in his hands. His breath was shallow, but he murmured something with each exhale, too faint to understand. The others were young. A girl with a burn on her arm, 2 boys with sunken cheeks, a woman with straw-colored hair who did not speak, but whose eyes never left the chapel's windows. They were led to the courtyard and offered water first, then broth, then rest. Brioni treated the burn. Ulrich helped carry the old man inside. Julien brought extra linens and filled bowls with fresh thyme water, placing one beside each cot. Later, the girl with the burn asked quietly, "Is this place safe?" "No place is safe," Brioni replied, "but this place is still standing." That night, Brioni and Ulrich sat beneath the archway where vines once bloomed, now heavy with seed pods that rattled faintly in the wind. The chapel behind them was dim, its hearths low, its halls quiet but full. "They'll keep coming," Brioni said, "and we'll keep making room," Ulrich answered. She looked at him, her face soft in the lamplight. "Do you regret staying?" "No," he said, "but I regret how many didn't live to stay with us." They fell silent, the kind of silence that deepened rather than emptied. From the hill, the second fire burned brighter now, joined by a third, farther east. Brioni watched them. "Do you think it's over?" "No," Ulrich replied, "but I think it's changing." In the chapel garden, green shoots had begun to push through the damp earth where elderflower had dropped its seed. Small signs, quiet promises. The dead no longer arrived in droves. The ledger had more blank pages now than it had all season. And the breath of the city, though still strained, no longer sounded like mourning alone. Something else had returned. Not joy, not yet, but maybe the memory of it. The fires on the hills had multiplied by morning, though few in Norcaster saw them as the city stirred slowly beneath a light mist. From the chapel roof, where Brioni stood wrapped in her long wool cloak, the smoldering dots gleamed like cautious stars along the distant tree lines and ridges. It was a strange reversal. Once Norcaster had been the beacon, burning alone in the dark. Now others signaled back like an old sleeping world beginning to blink awake. The morning was filled with labor. Rain the night before had soaked the courtyard and flooded the drainage channel behind the infirmary. Ulrich and 2 of the younger boys worked to dig a trench to carry the water off, their boots sinking ankle deep into mud. Julien helped by ferrying stones, placing them one by one into the trench bottom with careful hands, as though each were a tiny cornerstone of something greater. Inside, Brioni continued to prepare for what she now called the rising. Not a grand uprising, nothing like the stories told in fireside legend, but the slow, sure tide of the living returning. She organized the infirmary into separate wards, those recently arrived, those with lingering coughs, and those whose strength had begun to return. She marked the thresholds with colored cords, blue for rest, green for care, white for watch. It was simple, clear, and effective. The city's rhythm was shifting. From the upper window, Luck watched as the blacksmith opened his shop doors for the first time in months, setting out a small bucket of nails and a single, half-finished horseshoe. Further down the lane, the baker's widow swept her step and nailed a new board above her door, etched with the word bread in uneven strokes. Not far from the chapel, a trio of children, no older than Julien, had begun dragging broken crates into a circle near the old square. They didn't speak much, just worked in a quiet rhythm. When Ulrich passed by with a bundle of herbs, one of them looked up and said, "We're building a stage." "For what?" Ulrich asked. "For when music comes back," the boy replied. At the chapel, Brioni found herself called to the gate near midday. A woman stood there, tall and wind-burned, her cloak dark with travel, a small child strapped to her back and a wooden staff in one hand. "I saw the fire," the woman said simply. "My son's ill. We walked 3 days." Brioni stepped aside without hesitation. "You're welcome here." The boy was feverish but breathing well. No swelling, no signs of the black sores that had marked the worst of the plague. Brioni carried him in herself, laying him on a cot near the window where the light fell soft and clean. She crushed lavender and elderflower, setting them to steep. and stayed with him until the rhythm of his breathing evened. The mother, whose name was Mara, took to helping without being asked. Within hours, she had begun to chop wood for the kitchen hearth, and was seen later scrubbing the outer stones of the well with a bristled brush she carried in her own pack. "We kept to the forest," she told Ulrich that evening, sitting near the fire pit behind the chapel. "There are others, dozens, families living in old towers, hiding in abandoned barns, waiting." "Waiting for what?" Ulrich asked. "For the fear to pass," she said, then added, "or the fire to find them." In the quiet that followed, Julien came to sit beside her, curious about the brush she had used. Mara showed him the worn bristles, explaining how she'd woven them from pig hair and twine. He listened carefully, then ran off to find his own scrap of rope to try and copy it. Ulrich watched him go. "He's changing." "He's healing," Mara corrected. "That's slower, but it lasts longer." As the sun dipped behind the western wall, Brianni joined them, her sleeves rolled up, her hands stained from root and ash. She sat on the stone edge of the hearth, her back curved slightly, her eyes thoughtful. "I think we need to start teaching," she said suddenly. "Teaching?" Ulrich asked. "Not just care, or herbs, or how to clean wounds. Teaching the children, letters, numbers, songs, anything that reminds them of who they are, or what they might become." Mara nodded. "They've forgotten how to be children. That's as dangerous as the sickness." They began the next morning. Brianni set up a makeshift bench in the chapel's nave. Julien brought scraps of parchment, and one of the merchant's daughters, no more than 12, offered a box of blunt charcoal sticks. The first lesson was simple: names. Each child was given space to write their own. Some had never held a stylus. Others wrote in crooked lines, hesitating at every curve. But there was laughter. It was strange and bright, echoing off the old stone in a way that startled even the sisters. That night, Ulrich opened his ledger and added a new page. Not for the dead this time, but for the living. Names of those who had arrived. Notes beside each. Spoke again after 2 days. Volunteered to help with meals. Sings in the evening when she thinks no one is listening. Brioni leaned over his shoulder. A book of beginnings. He looked at her. "Yes, it's time we wrote one." And above them the stars scattered clearer than they had in weeks, sharp against the black, as if the heavens too were ready to begin again. The morning began with the sound of footsteps, light, rapid, and many. Ulrich heard them before he saw the children, their shapes darting between the chapel columns, their laughter sharp as birdsong. A small group had formed around Julien, who stood like a proud host near the wall, where Brioni had pinned pieces of parchment. On each sheet, a name had been carefully scrawled in charcoal, bordered by uneven drawings, flowers, trees, stars, and in one case, a sword that looked more like a bent fishing rod. "They wrote their names," Julien said, his eyes bright as Brioni approached. She knelt beside the parchment wall, her fingers brushing each name in turn. "They're learning fast." "They're remembering," Ulrich said behind her, "what it feels like to be noticed." That day, the chapel became something more than a shelter. It became a classroom. The nave was cleared, cots shifted to the sides, and long boards set across upturned crates for makeshift tables. Brioni led the morning lessons, simple rhymes, letters carved into wax boards, stories told in soft tones. The children listened, wide-eyed, their fingers twitching with nervous energy. In the afternoons, Ulrich took them outside. He showed them how to sharpen sticks into tools, how to make knots in rope, how to spot which herbs were safe and which ones would make a stomach turn. They practiced tying bundles and even digging shallow fire pits for when warmth would be needed in the open. It wasn't play, not quite, but there was joy in it. A joy so quiet and fragile that no one dared name it. The days were growing warmer. The dampness that had clung to the city's bones for months had lifted, and with it came smells long forgotten. The dusty sweetness of sun-warmed stone, the faint green of weeds pushing through the cracks, the charcoal-scented air from a hearth that now served food, not farewells. More arrived. From the hills, from the woods, from hollowed-out ruins where they had waited. They came in pairs, in threes, some alone, many with children. Most bore the marks of hunger more than illness. Their clothes were torn, their hands trembled. But when they saw the smoke rising from the chapel hearth, when they heard the faint sounds of voices not crying but laughing, they stepped forward with eyes wide and cautious. Mara became their guide. She met each group before they reached the chapel gate, speaking in low tones, assessing their needs. If they were sick, she led them to Brioni. If they were strong, she showed them where work waited. And if they were lost, she simply stood beside them until they found the courage to walk forward. Brother Osric, still silent in his ways, recorded the names. He kept his scrolls beneath the altar, adding each with the same careful ink strokes, no matter the age, no matter the condition. We count them all, he told Ulrich one evening. The sick, the strong, the broken, they all matter now. That night, Ulrich found Brioni in the garden, her hands deep in the earth, planting thyme beside the chapel wall. The soil was rich from months of ash and rot. New shoots had taken quickly, their green bright and defiant. We'll need more space, she said without looking up. We'll find it, he answered. We always do. She paused, then asked, do you think we'll ever truly be free of it? The sickness, the sorrow? No, Ulrich said softly, but I think we'll learn how to live with what it left behind. Brioni nodded. I want that to be enough. Later, she sat with Julin beneath the elder tree, its blossoms trembling in the breeze. He leaned against her, eyes half closed, humming one of the rhymes she had taught that morning. Brioni brushed his hair back, her touch slow and careful. In the chapel, the children continued to work by candlelight, their voices rising in quiet harmony as they practiced letters. One boy stood at the front and sang a verse in a trembling voice, and when he finished, the room clapped gently, almost reverently. And all the while, the fire in the chapel hearth burned low and steady, its smoke curling upward into a sky that had grown vast and soft with twilight. From the hills, no new fires were lit, but the ones that had already burned still glowed faintly. Waiting, watching. Ulrich looked out at them and saw not signals of desperation, but beacons of return. In his ledger, he wrote only 2 words that night: they're coming. And beneath them, he drew a small, crooked star. By midsummer, the chapel no longer whispered of sickness, but hummed with quiet industry. The scent of feverfew and ash had given way to the tang of cut herbs, warm bread, and sun on stone. The spaces once lined with cots were now shared between resting bodies and scattered lessons. Children's drawings cluttered the walls, some crude, some oddly precise, all vivid. The dead still lived in memory, but their shadows no longer clung to the air like fog. Julin awoke early each morning now. Before the bells, before the stirring of the sisters, he would slip from his cot and wander the garden barefoot. He tended the thyme beds Brioni had planted, checking each leaf for curl or blight, and watered the sage and rue with careful hands. He whispered to the plants, soft things he never shared with others. Then he returned indoors to help set out the slates and parchments for the day's lessons. Ulrich noticed how tall the boy was becoming. The roundness of his face had thinned, and his shoulders sat differently, still small, but braced. He spoke with more ease, even offered dry jokes now and then. And when Brioni was distracted, Julin often took her place at the lesson board, mimicking her calm tone with an endearing earnestness. It was Brioni who first suggested a second garden. There's a stretch of soil behind the apothecary wall, she said one morning, brushing dirt from her palms. It catches the late sun. We could plant vegetables. Ulrich nodded. What do you want to grow? Onions, carrots, beans if we can spare the space, something to feed the ones still coming. They began that afternoon, clearing weeds, turning the soil with old tools left behind by the last caretaker. Julin worked beside them, sleeves rolled high, dirt smudged across his nose. The soil gave easily, softened by rains, enriched by the ash that had settled there during the worst months. Brother Osric brought them a sack of seeds from his stores, carefully measured and labeled in tight script. He spoke little as always, but his eyes lingered on Brioni's hands, calloused yet gentle, pressing each seed into the furrowed earth with reverence. That which survives, he said quietly, must now grow. The rhythm of the chapel shifted again. Mornings belonged to lessons and healing. Midday to the gardens, the kitchens, the repairs. Evenings, however, became sacred. As the sun dipped behind the city walls, the community gathered in the nave, not for prayer exactly, but for something older, simpler. They shared stories. It began with Julin. One evening, unprompted, he stood before the others and spoke of the forest he and his mother had passed through while fleeing. He described trees so thick they blocked out the sun and a pond filled with frogs that croaked like old men. His voice trembled at first, but when Briani smiled at him from the corner, he found his footing. After him, a girl from the merchant quarter told of a cat she had hidden in her chimney for a month, feeding it crumbs from her rations. Another child recited a rhyme her grandmother used to hum, the words wobbly but sweet. Soon, even the adults joined. Mara spoke of winters in the eastern hills, where snow fell high enough to bury a man. Brother Osric shared, in his quiet way, a memory of his first days in the abbey. When he'd been so silent, no one knew he could sing until a bird startled him into it. And then one night, Briani spoke. She told of her brother, the one lost early in the plague. She described his carved wooden toys, his wild laugh, the way he would wrap himself in blankets and pretend to be a king. Her voice did not waver, but when she finished, she left the nave and did not return until the candles had burned low. Ulrich found her in the garden, seated beneath the elder tree. "I hadn't said his name aloud in a year," she said. "It hurt less than I thought, but it still hurt." He sat beside her. "That's what memory is," he said. "It doesn't vanish, but it softens." In the following days, others came forward to tell their stories, not always of sorrow, but of fragments from the world before, the taste of summer plums, the clang of a distant bell, the sound of rain on a tin roof, small things stitched into larger meaning. Brioni's second garden began to sprout. Green shoots broke through the soil, reaching upward, unbothered by all the silence and suffering that had soaked the ground before them. The children marked each plant with stones etched in charcoal: hope, strength, beginning. One stone, left by Julin, bore only the word again. More arrivals trickled in, but they no longer came hollow-eyed. Word had spread beyond the hills. The chapel, once a place of endings, had become a place of return. And above it all, the sky stretched vast and clear, a canvas slowly filling with stars. Each night, after the stories ended and the candles were snuffed, Ulrich opened his ledger. He still kept a record of the dead, but now, beside those pages, he recorded the names of the living. A second list, a mirror, a promise. He had begun to call it the Book of the Returned. Summer deepened. The light lingered longer in the evenings, stretching amber and gold across the chapel floors, catching dust motes in the air like drifting stars. The gardens flourished under the careful tending of many hands. What had begun as Briani's vision had become a collective labor. Rows of beans curled upward around twine-laced posts. The onions fattened beneath the earth. Even the stubborn wild sage by the south wall had bloomed, its leaves humming with bees. Children laughed more freely now. They no longer flinched at loud sounds or shadowed corners. Julin and a group of the older boys had taken to carving whistles from hollow reeds, their music strange and shrill, but full of life. Briani let them play outside the infirmary windows, saying even the sick should hear something joyful. Inside the chapel, fewer cots were needed for the ill. More were used for the tired, the newly arrived, or the very old. Briani had begun organizing supplies for the approaching autumn. Jarred roots, dried herbs, sealed bundles of flour in wax cloth. There was talk of building a smokehouse for meat and a larger oven for baking. One evening, as she and Ulrich walked the path between the gardens and the eastern courtyard, Briani paused beside the old olive tree and said, "It's been almost a year." Ulrich looked up at the sky, now painted in streaks of lilac and rose. "Since the first bell?" She nodded. "Since the first body came through the chapel gates. I still remember the sound of the cart, the creak of the wheels." He did too. It lived in his bones. They stood in silence for a time. "I wonder how many people still count the days," she said. "Or if they've begun to measure time by something else." "By the living," Ulrich replied. "By the ones who came back." She looked at him, then at the children weaving garlands of clover nearby, and smiled faintly. "Then we should mark the day somehow, not with grief, but with grace." That night, Briani called a quiet council. She gathered Sister Wilda, Brother Osric, Mara, Ulrich, and two others who had remained steady since the early months, a potter named Elric and a former seamstress named Hesta. They sat at the long table in the refectory, oil lamps flickering. "We've survived," Briani said simply. "That alone is reason enough to gather, but I want something more." "Like a feast?" Elric asked, his rough hands folded politely. "Like remembrance," Briani answered, "but not for what we lost, for what we've rebuilt." Hesta nodded. A naming, a reckoning, a way to say, we are still here. Osric said nothing, but he drew from his sleeve a narrow parchment already lined with dates. I kept time, he murmured, even when there were no voices left to mark it. Ulrich glanced at him, then back at Brioni. What do you have in mind? Music, food, a fire, stories, she said. Let the city see that we are more than survivors, that we've become keepers. So preparations began. Word spread quickly through Norcaster. Those who had hidden returned cautiously, men with weathered faces, women with wary eyes, children with nowhere else to be. The old market square was swept clean. The broken fountain was filled with fresh water and wildflowers. From the chapel they carried benches and stools. Hesta and two others stitched a banner from scraps of cloth, greens, grays, golds, blues. On it they embroidered a single phrase, "Still we rise." Brioni planned every detail carefully. Mara oversaw the cooking, blending old recipes with the little they had: root stew, honeyed oat cakes, and warm cider made from the last of the apples. Julin and the other children rehearsed a procession, carrying bundles of herbs tied with twine and whispering names from the ledger as they walked. Ulrich helped build the pyre, not for burning grief, but for the fire that would light the first night of remembrance. It was made of seasoned wood, bound in vines and crowned with dried lavender. He worked in silence, his hands steady, his thoughts on all who had passed and all who might have stayed if the world had been kinder. When the day came, the city gathered. People stood shoulder to shoulder around the square, their clothes patched but clean, their faces lined with sorrow and endurance alike. Brioni stood at the center, her cloak caught in the soft wind, her hands raised not in command, but in welcome. Tonight, she said, we remember, not just the silence, but the voices that carried us here. The children passed through the crowd, each placing a sprig of thyme at the base of the fire. One girl left a stone etched with a name. A boy laid down a ribbon from his mother's old cloak. When the last offering was placed, Ulrich stepped forward and touched flame to the base. The fire rose slowly, then with strength, the smoke curling into the stars. Then came stories. From every corner of the crowd, voices rose, memories, jokes, laments, songs. One by one, people spoke. No one was hurried. No one was shamed for tears. Brioni listened to every word. Julin sat by her feet, his head tilted to the sky. And when the stories waned, when the fire had settled into glowing coals, the banner was raised between two beams. Still we rise, glowing in the firelight like a promise. Ulrich looked at Brioni. We did this, he said. No, she whispered. They did. We just held the light long enough for them to find it. And as the fire crackled in the night, Norcaster stood together. Not as what it once had been, but as something new, something born of ruin, shaped in silence, and named not by sorrow, but by the will to endure. The fire's embers glowed deep into the night, casting long shadows across the worn stones of the market square. Few spoke after the stories had ended. Instead, the city of Norcaster stood together in a rare and sacred quiet, listening not to words, but to the sound of presence, of people breathing side by side, alive here. Julin had fallen asleep with his head in Brioni's lap, his fingers curled loosely around the edge of her cloak. She sat unmoving for a long time, her hand resting lightly on his back, eyes fixed on the fire. Ulrich, seated nearby, stared into the glowing heart of the coals, his thoughts adrift among memories he hadn't spoken aloud. When the last flame had flickered to smoke and the banner was lowered and folded away, the people returned to their homes, their shelters, or in some cases, the chapel floor. No one rushed. The streets felt warmer, even without the fire, safer, like the ground beneath them no longer threatened to shift. In the days that followed, something subtle changed. People began to look up more often when they passed each other. They spoke each other's names. Hands touched shoulders. Bread was broken and shared not just in need, but in gesture. The fear had not vanished, but it had softened. No longer the sharp edge of survival, but something slower, quieter. A memory fading into habit. Brioni took note of these changes as she walked the chapel grounds in the early light. Children now rose before the bells, eager to beat each other to the garden paths. A group of older boys had begun shaping the stones of the southern wall, trying to rebuild what weather and time had worn down. And Mara had started leading short walks to the hill's edge beyond the eastern gate, guiding the sick who could walk to see the sunrise. Light reminds them of breath, she told Briani one morning, that the world still stretches beyond their grief. Brother Osric continued to write, his scrolls growing longer, more detailed. He now wrote not only names but births, apprenticeships, marriages reclaimed, trades remembered. He bound them in cloth dyed with plant inks, setting them carefully into wooden boxes lined with oilskin. The book of the returned was no longer a ledger. It was becoming an archive. Julien took to reading beside him in the afternoons, his finger tracking each line slowly, whispering the names as he went. Ulrich, meanwhile, began to walk further each day, beyond the chapel, beyond the gate, into the city itself. What he found both saddened and steadied him. The upper quarter remained hushed, many homes locked, some overgrown with ivy, but the lower lanes were stirring. A weaver had reopened her shop, hanging lengths of hand-dyed cloth from the windows. A stonemason was mending chimneys with his son, and near the old well, a small group of young women had cleared out a crumbled wine house and begun turning it into a gathering place. For news, they said, for voices. Ulrich spoke little during these visits. He was not there to lead, only to see, to carry news back, to bear witness. One afternoon, as he crossed the bridge near the granary, he was stopped by an old man sitting beside a cart of wicker baskets. The man offered him a plum. Ulrich declined gently, but the man insisted. "It's the first I've picked in 3 years," the man said, "and I'd rather share it than count it." The fruit was soft, sweet, and warm from the sun. Ulrich returned to the chapel with the taste still on his tongue. That evening, Briani was in the kitchen. Sleeves rolled high, her hands in dough. The air smelled of herbs and yeast. She looked up when Ulrich entered, brushing flour from her cheek. "You've been gone longer than usual." "The city's waking up," he said. "It doesn't know it yet, but it is." Briani smiled. "Then we need to be ready." They baked until the lamps dimmed. Loaves of spiced bread, oat cakes with honey, flat rounds of ash-baked dough for travel. Mara brought dried roots from the stores, and together they packed parcels for those beginning to rebuild beyond the chapel's reach. By the end of the week, a new pattern had emerged. Each morning, a group left the chapel with carts, carrying bread, dried herbs, cloth, soap, tools. They moved through Norcaster not as rescuers, but as neighbors. They didn't knock on doors. They waited nearby. Those who needed came forward. Some returned with gifts in kind, eggs, bottles of cider, baskets of mushrooms. Others returned only with words, and even that was enough. And so the city began to stitch itself back together, not in grandeur, not with banners or declarations, but with quiet acts, with bread passed hand to hand, with names spoken aloud, with songs hummed beneath breath as floors were swept and gardens weeded. Briani kept teaching. Each week she added a new story to the children's lessons, not of saints or kings, but of real people, survivors. She told the tale of the candlemaker who had taught by firelight, of the boy who sang for his sister until the fever passed, of the girl who had drawn birds on every wall in her home until color was all that remained. And always at the end she would say, "We are not the ones who waited. We are the ones who made a way." Julien had begun to say it with her, softly, each time a little louder. Ulrich watched it all, not with pride, but with wonder. That they had survived was a miracle. That they had begun again was something deeper. One night, he opened his ledger and stared at the first pages, the early names, those written with a trembling hand, smudged with dirt and grief. He turned to the newest page. At the top, he wrote in steady ink, "The season has turned," and beneath it, "Let it be known." The days grew warmer still, and the city took on the scent of dry stone and crushed thyme beneath wandering feet. Norcaster, once cloaked in silence and shadow, was now filled with the soft murmurs of voices, the thrum of tools against timber, and the occasional burst of laughter echoing down streets that had, for so long, only known footsteps. At the chapel, the rhythm of life had changed once more. The children rose with purpose, no longer needing to be gathered. Lessons had become habit. So too had care. Tasks were shared, without being assigned, without questions. Everyone had become part of something larger than themselves, as though the lines between the chapel and the city had blurred. Briani watched this unfolding quietly. She had always worked without noise, but now her silences carried weight. People waited for her thoughts. Even the sisters, once so certain in their order, had begun to follow her gaze before making decisions. One morning, she stood before the second garden, now wild with green, and placed her hand gently on the soil. "The roots are deep enough," she said aloud. Mara, nearby with a basket of herbs, looked over. "You thinking of planting more?" Brianni shook her head slowly. "No, I'm thinking it's time to share what we've grown." That week, they began a new effort, gathering seeds, cutting sprigs, drying bundles of leaves and flowers. Brianni prepared them with the same care she used in healing, wrapping the seeds in cloth tied with strands of flax, labeling each with charcoal symbols for growth, for strength, for memory. "We'll send them out," she explained to Ulrich, "to the places where they've started again, to teach them how to grow more than food." He nodded. A new kind of harvest. The first bundles were sent with the morning carts. Each was tucked into a satchel beside bread and soap, a quiet offering for the days still to come. In the city, other signs of change began to show. A small group of children began painting walls. Chalk first, then crushed berry and charcoal pigment. They painted vines, birds, stars. Their favorite was a great tree with a hollow trunk, inside which they painted a little door. "It's where the stories sleep," one child told Ulrich, "until someone needs them again." By midsummer's peak, the heat lay heavy on the stones, and the air shimmered above rooftops. People moved slower, but they moved with ease. There were fewer fevers now. The sickness, it seemed, had retreated. Not gone, not forgotten, but weakened, contained, like smoke trapped behind glass. That night, Brianni stood atop the chapel with Ulrich beside her. They watched as the last streak of sunlight curled over the hills, bathing the rooftops in a warm, amber hush. "I dreamed of this," she said, "of summer, of peace that didn't feel borrowed." Ulrich glanced toward the city. "And now that it's here?" She hesitated. "I wonder what comes next." He didn't answer, not right away. But he thought of the children drawing roots in chalk, of Mara teaching next to make soap, of Osric now training 2 scribes to help him record the living. "We keep building," Ulrich said, "even if we don't know what for yet." The moon rose slowly. Below them, a soft chorus of crickets had begun. And from one corner of the chapel yard, the sound of humming. Julien again, turning over soil beside a new row of basil. A few days later, they received their first messenger from beyond the eastern road. She was a tall woman in a faded green cloak, sun-browned and quiet, with 2 long braids trailing down her back. She arrived with a small cart pulled by a donkey and carried with her a wooden box covered in beeswax cloth. "For Brianni," she said, "and the ledger keeper." They met her beneath the old olive tree. Inside the box were jars of salves, tinctures, oils, and scrolls of carefully written recipes, some with notes in the margins. On top, a small sack of black seeds. "From a place we've made," the woman explained, "a village near the river, where the ground is soft again." Brianni turned the sack in her hands. "You saw the fire?" The woman nodded. "We kept waiting for it. Then one night, we saw 3. She didn't stay, just asked for water and rest for her donkey. By sundown, she was on the road again. After she left, Brianni placed the sack of seeds on the altar. Beside it, she laid a sprig of thyme from the second garden and a slip of parchment with one word written carefully in charcoal: "Returned." In the days that followed, more messengers arrived, some with stories, others with supplies. A few asked to stay. One man, a carpenter, began restoring the north wall of the chapel, saying only that he needed to work with his hands again. Another, a midwife, began teaching the young women how to care for new life. Not all who came were healed. Some bore loss still. Some could not yet speak. But the fire of Norcaster had become more than smoke. It had become a gathering point, a lighthouse without walls. Brianni wrote each name in a new ledger, this one bound in soft leather and dyed the color of oak leaves. The first page bore no list, only a line she copied from the stone at the garden's edge. "Where the roots are deep, there need be no fear of the wind." The wind changed with the coming of early autumn. It no longer swept in with the bitterness of sickness, nor the hollow whistle of deserted streets. Instead, it carried scents, wood smoke, dried herbs, earth turned with iron tines. There was movement in the leaves again, not from fear, but from the slow shift of seasons, one that promised a softer dusk and long amber evenings. In the chapel garden, Brianni bent low over a row of sun-withered basil, trimming the last usable leaves and letting the dry ones fall back into the soil. She had begun preparing the beds for winter now. The mint had already been hung to dry. The thyme had been bound into tight little bunches and tucked into satchels for travelers. Only the sage still flourished, stubborn and thick, as if it too refused to leave this brief season of peace. Julin, now taller by a hand's span and lean from constant motion, had taken up sweeping the garden paths before the first bell. Each morning he did it without being asked, careful not to stir the dust too high. On one such morning, he found a bird resting beneath the old elm. Its wing was crooked, and its feathers dulled. He knelt beside it, whispered something only the bird heard, and returned later with water and a folded scrap of linen from the apothecary. Bryony watched him from the doorway. "You've become someone," she said softly as he returned with the bundle. Julin looked up, then glanced at the bird in his hands. It just needed someone to see it. Inside the chapel, the rhythm of the days had settled. Lessons continued, quieter now, less about recovery and more about becoming. The older children were learning to read from Brother Osric's transcribed pages. The younger ones had taken to songs, old ones braided with new words, verses reimagined. They often sang while sorting dried leaves or counting roots. Ulrich had begun helping the carpenter rebuild the outer chapel wall. The man, whose name was Castor, was broad-shouldered and deliberate, more comfortable with hammers than with conversation. Together they set new beams, smoothed rough stone, filled cracks with lime. And in those hours of shared labor, Ulrich found a calm he had never known during the years of sickness. There was something grounding about rebuilding what had once crumbled. One morning, as they worked in companionable silence, Castor paused and looked out across the city. "You think it'll stay like this?" he asked. Ulrich wiped his brow. "I think it'll change again, but not the same way." "You afraid of the change?" "No," Ulrich said, "but I think we'll have to remember what we learned." Castor nodded and tapped a beam into place. "Then let's build with that in mind." Further into the city, new signs of life had begun to bloom. Market stalls appeared again, cautious but steady. Baskets of late pears, bundles of dried beans, even a few flasks of honeyed mead exchanged quietly under the awning of a rebuilt tavern. The sounds were returning, horses clopping on stone, the creak of wagons, children calling out in play. And still they came, not in the desperate numbers of before, but in slow trickles. One family here, a solitary wanderer there. All carried the marks of having lived through something vast. Not all spoke of it. Some wept upon arrival. Others asked only for a place to sleep. Mara kept track of them, now aided by a younger woman named Lise, who had arrived with a twisted ankle and stayed to care for the infirm. Together they prepared bedding, clean water, a place by the fire. No one was turned away. One evening, Briani stood before the chapel steps, holding a scroll of rough parchment. She turned to Ulrich, who stood beside her. "We need to speak to the city," she said. He looked at her. "You're ready?" She nodded. "Not for a sermon, for an invitation." So it was that on the first day of true autumn, Briani stood before the gathered people of Norcaster. They had come willingly. Families, tradespeople, the elderly and the young, all stood around the market square, quiet, expectant. She wore no cloak of office, no badge of station. Just the old green shawl she'd had since the first frost, stitched at the corners, softened by time. She unrolled the parchment slowly, then let it fall to her side. "I came to this place with nothing but breath," she said. "I had no family left. I had no name worth speaking. And I truly thought, that survival would be the end of all stories." Her voice did not waver. But it wasn't. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the chapel in the distance, its windows catching the light of early evening. "Somewhere in that place, something changed. Not just for me, for many of you. We planted, we waited, we remembered." She paused, "And now we build." A murmur rose from the crowd, not loud, not frenzied, just the sound of breath held and released together. "This city is still yours," Briani continued, "and now if you wish it, it can be something more. Not what it was, but what it has become, honest, quiet, enduring." She lifted the scroll once more. "I ask not for service, not for loyalty, only for your part, a skill, a story, a name to write in the book of the living." And then she stepped back. One by one, people came forward. A weaver offered to teach the children how to spin flax. A woodcarver said he would craft benches for the new hall. A widow gave her husband's tools. A boy, barely 10, brought a pouch of seeds and asked if they might grow. And Brownie smiled. Ulrich recorded the names, his ink steady. Julian stood nearby, holding a lantern. The fire no longer needed to be lit to be seen. It had taken root, in hands and voices in the very stones of Norcaster. And with the season turning, it no longer burned only for remembrance. It burned for return. As the season deepened, the mornings arrived wrapped in a silver hush. Mist gathered low in the city's hollows, clinging to rooftops and curling around stone corners like a veil drawn over old memories. Norcaster stirred more slowly now, not out of fear, but from the weight of days well lived and steadily earned. The world had not returned to what it once was, but it had become something else, gentler, quieter, resilient. Bryony rose before the bells most mornings, often before the sun. She walked the chapel grounds with a basket looped over one arm, gathering fallen leaves, bits of dry herb, and small stones turned up by rain. Her steps were quiet, measured, as if she were listening for something deeper beneath the surface of the day. Julian often joined her. He'd grown taller again, his limbs more certain, his eyes still watchful but no longer shadowed. He carried a satchel now, full of his own tools, bits of charcoal, string, scraps of waxed parchment. He had taken to sketching what he saw, the chapel spire through fog, the curl of time along a windowsill, the way shadows fell from the tree by the eastern wall. "This is how I remember," he told Bryony once, holding up a smudged drawing of the garden gate. She had simply nodded. "Then keep going. You're building something." Within the chapel, the seasons brought change as well. The hall, once used for the sick, had been cleared and repurposed as a library of sorts. Brother Osric, with the help of his new scribes, had arranged his scrolls and ledgers along low wooden shelves. There were no grand tomes, no precious illuminations, but the books carried names, dates, instructions for healing, recipes, weather records, songs, prayers, and fragments of stories recovered from memory. "Knowledge should not survive in silence," Osric said one evening, rolling a fresh scroll tight. "It should walk with the people." The children now visited the library often, their fingers tracing the rough leather bindings, their voices soft with reverence. It became a place of questions, a place for beginning again. In the city beyond, change moved more slowly, but steadily. A new bakery opened near the southern gate, its windows hung with linen, its hearth warm with rising loaves. The scent drifted up the lane each morning, a quiet invitation. A group of young musicians began playing in the square on market days, their instruments cobbled from broken lutes and mended strings, their songs a blend of old ballads and new verses, some written by children with chalk-stained hands. Ulrich watched all this unfold with a quiet heart. He still walked the city each day, not to record the dead or search for signs of plague, but simply to see. He carried a ledger still, but now its pages bore different marks, lists of offerings made, skills shared, names added to the book of the returned. He wrote carefully, always in the same ink, always with the same small note at the bottom of each page. Contributed. He seldom spoke while walking, but people greeted him often, sometimes with words, sometimes with a nod. Once, a child ran up to him with a ribbon and tied it to his sleeve without explanation, then ran off laughing. "You're becoming part of the place," Bryony told him later when she noticed the ribbon. "I think the place is becoming part of me," he replied. There were still quiet moments of grief. A woman who had nursed 3 orphans passed away in her sleep one cool morning. Her name, Nera, was written on the chapel's garden stone by Julian in careful charcoal script. The children who had once clung to her skirts now helped carry her to rest beneath the yew tree, and each placed a sprig of marjoram at her feet. "We do not forget," Bryony said as they stood beside the grave. "Not because we cannot, but because we choose not to." That evening, a storm rolled in from the west, slow and low, with wind that rattled shutters and stirred the trees into murmuring. Within the chapel, lanterns were lit, and people gathered close. The children sang quietly, their voices rising like thread from the hearth. Bryony and Ulrich sat near the doorway, watching the rain as it streaked down the old glass. "Do you think we'll always stay here?" Ulrich asked after a while. Bryony considered this. "I used to dream of leaving," she said, "of walking until nothing hurt anymore. And now, I think we've made something worth staying for." He looked at her then, truly looked, and saw not the girl who had once stood shaking beside the trench or the quiet healer in the smoke-filled halls, but someone entirely new. someone shaped by ashes and choice and countless unspoken mercies. He reached for her hand, not in question, not in urgency, just in presence, and she did not let go. Outside, the wind howled briefly, then softened. The rain slowed to a patter. The city settled again, wrapped in its new skin, and the chapel, like a heart long steady, beat quietly in time with the lives it had gathered, held, and set gently back into the world. The first frost came overnight, soft as breath on glass. When the sun rose, it painted the chapel rooftops in silver, each tile glistening with a thin, cold sheen. The garden leaves bowed under the weight of it, edges curled like parchment touched by flame. Yet nothing had died. The herbs would fade soon, yes, but they had seeded deep, and the soil beneath them still held warmth. Brownie stepped into the garden in her boots and thick shawl, brushing frost from the last of the sage. Julien followed, wrapped in 2 scarves, his hands red with cold but smiling all the same. He had taken to carrying a small knife now, not as a weapon, but as a tool for carving sticks, trimming cord, whittling shapes. He'd etched a feather into the handle, a quiet tribute to the injured bird he had cared for weeks before. It had flown from his hand only days ago, vanishing into the treetops with a sharp cry that still echoed in his memory. "This frost is kind," Brioni said, turning over a clump of earth. "It tells us the end is near, but it doesn't rush it." Julien knelt beside her. "Do you think it will snow soon?" "Soon," she replied, "but not yet." Inside the chapel, preparations for winter had begun in earnest. The outer walls had been reinforced with timber and clay, and the old chapel windows were now lined with oiled cloth to keep out the worst of the wind. Briani, Ulrich, Mera, and the others had created storage rooms, root cellars filled with dried vegetables, sealed jars of stew and syrup, neatly bound stacks of herbs. Nothing was wasted. Every stem, every scrap of wool, every bit of twine had a place. Ulrich spent much of his time by the hearth in the scriptorium now. With brother Osric and the younger scribes, he copied not just names and trades, but stories. Folk tales gathered from across Norcaster, recipes remembered by elders, riddles passed from child to child, and small poems left on walls or found folded in pockets of the dead. The Book of the Returned had become more than a ledger. It had become a record of the soul of the city. One afternoon, as the clouds gathered thick above and the air grew heavy with the smell of impending snow, Briani entered the scriptorium with a bundle wrapped in linen. "I found this," she said, unrolling it carefully before Osric and Ulrich. It was in the bottom of the herb basket, tucked beneath the dried lavender. Inside was a small book, its cover of dark leather worn soft. On the first page, written in elegant but faded script, was a name neither of them knew, Leora of the Riverborn. Ulrich turned the page gently. Inside were drawings, plants mostly, but also animals, insects, even the occasional figure in motion. Next to each notes, healing properties, recipes, instructions, brief poems. Osric's hands hovered above the pages, reverent. "It's an herb journal," Briani said. "But more than that, it's a life. I think someone meant to leave it behind, for whoever found it." Ulrich nodded. "Then we should add it to the library, but let it stand on its own." Osric agreed. "Not everything must be rewritten. Some things are perfect in their own silence." That night, a gentle snow fell. The city watched it from windows and stoops, heads tilted upward. There was no rush to shelter. Children ran with outstretched arms, catching flakes on their tongues. Julien sat with Briani and Ulrich beneath the chapel eaves, the snow settling lightly in his hair. "It's different this year," he said. Briani smiled. "It is." "No fear in it," Ulrich added, "just quiet." When the snow deepened, the chapel grew warmer inside. Fires burned in every hearth, and woolen blankets were draped along every bench and cot. Mera organized winter meals, spiced lentils, thick bread, broth seasoned with dried herbs and marrow. Each evening, the people of Norcaster gathered not out of need, but of choice. They told stories still, but now they also planned. A carpenter wanted to build a new meeting hall come spring. A midwife spoke of teaching a new generation of healers. Children practiced music, preparing for a winter festival that Briani had gently named the Day of Lanterns. They planned to hang lit jars from the trees, carry them through the streets, and leave one burning by every doorstep to honor those who had come before. Julien took the task seriously. He had already carved the bases for 3 lanterns and etched small sigils into each, one for light, one for memory, and one for home. The festival would come soon. But for now, Norcaster rested. Briani stood one night before the chapel's wide door, looking out across the blanketed courtyard. Snow covered everything evenly. There were no paths yet, no tracks. Ulrich joined her, lantern in hand. "We'll leave footprints in the morning," she nodded. "Together." And as the light from the chapel spilled across the snow, soft and gold, the silence between them was not empty. It was full. The snow thickened over the next week, laying soft and white across the rooftops and blanketing the garden paths until only the tallest herb stalks poked through. The city slowed, not out of fear or scarcity, but in a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Each morning began in silence, broken only by the crunch of boots and the faint creak of shutters being opened to the pale, patient light. Within the chapel, the hearths burned steadily. Heat spread gently through the old stone, carrying with it the smell of cedar, dried orange peel, and cinnamon from the bundles Briani had tucked above the mantels. Children clustered near the warmth after lessons, carving small tokens from wood and practicing for the coming day of lanterns. Julian had begun building lanterns in earnest. Each one was unique, some tall and thin, others squat and round, with colored paper windows and bits of pressed herb sealed beneath the wax. He worked from dawn to dusk, often beside the carpenter Castor, who helped him measure joints and sand rough edges smooth. One afternoon, Julian presented Briani with a lantern of his own. It was simple, 4 panels of thin birch wood held together by twine, with a tiny drawing of an elder tree etched into one side. "For the first light," he said, placing it in her hands. Briani looked at it for a long moment. "It's beautiful." "It's yours," he said softly. Outside, the city buzzed with quiet preparation. People had begun to emerge from winter's hush, gathering what they could, scraps of ribbon, bits of old glass, colored thread, to craft their own lanterns. Word of the coming festival had spread beyond the chapel walls. Those who had once fled now walked Norcaster streets with eyes lifted to the rooftops, waiting for the first sign. The first lantern was lit 3 days before the festival. It stood in the chapel window, burning low and steady in a jar of river glass. No one had spoken as Briani placed it there, only watched as the flame took hold and cast its golden glow across the frost-laced panes. That night, more appeared. By morning, every window in the city held a lantern. Some were small and plain, others shimmered with bits of crystal and pressed flowers, but all held light. The day of lanterns arrived beneath a clear sky. Snow still covered the city, but the air had softened, and the wind carried the scent of pine and warmth from a dozen open hearths. Children marched in rows, lanterns swinging from sticks above their heads. Songs rose, not the dirges of mourning, but verses made of new words, laughter woven into melody. Briani led the procession, her shawl wrapped tight, Julian at her side. They passed through every street, stopping at the edge of the old burial fields where the snow lay undisturbed and quiet as breath. There, each child placed a lantern in the snow. They didn't speak, but they waited. The wind died. The flames flickered, then held. Ulrich stood at the edge of the field, the Book of the Returned in his hands. He read no names aloud. He simply opened to the last page and wrote, "They lit the night." When they returned to the chapel, Briani found herself standing beneath the elder tree, the same one where she had once whispered to the earth during the early days of fever and smoke. The branches were bare now, laced with frost, but the bark still held the warmth of sun. Julian stood beside her. "Do you think they see it? The ones we lost?" He nodded. Briani looked up at the hundreds of lanterns now burning across Norcaster, each one a promise made and kept. "Yes," she said. "I think they do." That night, the lanterns burned long into the dark. No wind came to snuff them. No snow fell to cover them. People stood outside their homes, arms around one another, watching the city glow. And inside the chapel, Ulrich placed the Book of the Returned upon the altar and closed it gently. It was not an ending, but it was the completion of something sacred. A chapter of ash and healing. A season of remembering. A year of quiet, hard-earned light. The days after the Day of Lanterns passed like the last pages of a well-loved book, slow, careful, each one holding a stillness that asked to be remembered. The snow no longer fell heavily, but in soft flurries that caught in the folds of cloaks and clung to windowsills like scattered feathers. Norcaster had grown quiet again, though not with sorrow. It was the quiet of peace. Bryony sat each morning in the chapel garden, now asleep beneath frost. She did not tend it in the winter months, but she visited. She sat on the low stone wall with her shawl wrapped close and her hands resting in her lap. Sometimes she brought Julian, sometimes not. Often she was alone, listening. Ulrich still walked the city. He no longer carried the ledger, not every day. The Book of the Returned had been placed in the chapel's library beside Osric's scrolls, its pages bound tight and wrapped in cloth stitched with threads of sage green. Now, Ulrich walked for the sake of walking, for seeing, for bearing witness to how the city continued to become itself. He noticed things others had begun to forget. A girl singing to herself while sweeping snow from a stoop. A man carving a new door frame with careful hands. A boy building a snow figure beside an old well and giving it a crown of pine cones. These things mattered. He began writing again, but not records, reflections, fragments. He kept a smaller book now, bound in rough leather, and inside it his handwriting wandered like a stream. Lines about lanterns, about the scent of thawing earth, about the memory of hands that had once worked beside him and no longer could. And beside some passages he wrote only initials. Names known, names carried. Julian had taken over much of the daily tending in the chapel. He swept, stoked the fires, checked the herb stores, even instructed the younger children in the basics of gathering and drying. He had grown into his voice slowly, like a branch stretching toward the sun. Now he used it gently. One afternoon, while helping Mara portion out the last jars of preserved roots, he paused and asked, "What will we do when the stores run low?" Mara smiled, drawing her shawl tighter. "Then we begin again." "But what if it's not enough?" "Then we begin again anyway." The answer settled into him like snow. That same evening, Bryony called a gathering, not urgent, not solemn, just a meeting in the old way. People came with their cloaks still damp from walking, lanterns in hand. The chapel hall was warm, the fire low and steady, the benches were full. Bryony stood not behind the altar, but before it, where the light struck her hands and the hem of her dress shimmered with frost melt. "It has been a year," she said simply. No one needed the reminder. They all carried the count within them. "And in that year," she continued, "we have mourned and we have mended. We have gathered and given. We have planted, and we have watched what we planted begin to grow." She looked slowly across the room, her gaze meeting familiar eyes, new faces. "The time has come not only to keep what we have, but to give it away." A murmur moved through the hall. Bryony raised her hand gently. "We know what it means to begin again. We know how to tend, to teach, to wait. But beyond our walls, there are still places where silence has never lifted, where healing hasn't come. I say now, let us go, not to escape, but to extend. Let us carry the fire." There was no cheer, no burst of applause, only nods, quiet understanding, the kind that comes when a people know what must be done and have already begun doing it in their hearts. That night a map was drawn, simple lines, old roads, the memory of old trade routes traced with charcoal. Ulrich marked villages once lost, Mara named valleys she had passed through in the first dark months. Osric brought scrolls from the abbey detailing where the plague had not yet receded. And in the days that followed, preparations began. Bryony walked the garden one last time, her fingers brushing the edge of a frost-laced rosemary plant. Julian stood at her side, a satchel already half-packed with herbs and folded paper. He would not stay behind. "You're sure?" she asked, though she already knew. He nodded. "The lanterns don't carry themselves." Ulrich joined them at the gate, his own pack slung over his shoulder, the smaller journal tucked safely inside. They would not go far at first. Just one village, one town. A place called Dalewood, where the river ran slow and quiet, and a chapel stood in ruin, waiting for voices. As they stepped into the snow, a dozen others joined behind them, some with carts, some with tools, some with nothing but themselves. Norcaster did not weep at their leaving. It stood in quiet blessing. The fires would remain, the gardens would be tended, the chapel would stay open. They were not abandoning it. They were planting it again, farther and farther into the waiting world. The road to Dalewood was half forgotten, its path winding through long stretches of birch and oak, where branches bowed low with snow. The trees whispered with each wind that passed, their voices hushed but not mournful. The snow was deeper beyond Norcaster's walls, untouched by carts or feet. Each step left a mark. Each breath rose like mist between sentences. Bryony walked at the front of the procession, her staff tapping gently in the snow. Beside her, Julien carried a bundle of carefully wrapped lanterns, each one marked with a symbol drawn in charcoal, a star, a flame, a sprig of sage. Ulrich kept the rear, his eyes on the trees and the tracks they left behind, one hand always resting near the leather-bound journal that hung at his side. They numbered 14. Mara walked near the center, a cart drawn by 2 donkeys trailing behind her, loaded with seed bundles, dried roots, soap, and cloth. Brother Osric had remained behind, tending to the growing archive and instructing his new scribes. In his place, one of his apprentices, a quiet girl named Sarah, walked with scrolls tied beneath her cloak, ready to record what they found. The journey was not hard, only long. Each night they made camp in the lee of old stone walls or beneath sheltering trees, lighting a small fire and placing one lantern at its edge. They called it the memory flame, never spoken of aloud, but always watched in silence. By the 5th day the path grew narrower, the trees pressing in like listeners. And then, as the sun broke through a low sweep of clouds, they saw it, Dalewood. The village sat in a low hollow, half sunk into snow. Roofs had caved on some buildings, others leaned askew. Smoke rose faintly from only 2 chimneys. A chapel, once fine, stood at the far end, its steeple cracked and tilting slightly. The road into the village was lined with old markers, some broken, others buried in frost. They did not enter with ceremony. Brownie walked slowly to the first house, her hand raised not in command, but in greeting. A door opened before she could knock. A man, thin and pale, peered out. Behind him, the dark shape of a hearth cast faint warmth. "We're not here to take," Briani said, "only to ask what you need." The man blinked, then stepped aside. That first day, they said little. They unpacked supplies near the old square, lit a fire, and offered broth and bread to any who came. And slowly they did come. Women wrapped in cloaks too thin for winter, children with watchful eyes, one old man who walked without boots, his feet wrapped in cloth. Dalewood had not fallen entirely, but it had been holding its breath. By evening, Briani had spoken with a dozen villagers. Mara had shared dried herbs with 2 mothers whose children were still feverish. Sarah had begun sketching the chapel ruins, noting the weak timbers and fallen slates. Julien stood at the chapel's door as dusk fell. He held one of his lanterns in both hands, waiting. Brownie approached. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. He stepped inside the broken chapel, placed the lantern on the altar stone, and lit it. The flame flickered against the walls, casting its glow across the dust, the broken beams, the faded glass, and with it, the room no longer felt abandoned. That night, Ulrich wrote in his journal beside the fire, "Dalewood is not empty. It is simply waiting." He paused, then added, "The light has arrived, not to rescue, but to remember." Over the next days, the villagers began to share. They had survived the plague, but barely. A healer had died early, a storehouse burned in a storm. No merchants had come in nearly a year. The last priest had vanished into the woods, leaving behind only an old bell and a trunk of torn vestments. Briani listened to every story. Ulrich recorded each name. Mara taught them how to steep herbs again, how to dry roots against the wall of a home. Julien showed the children how to make simple lanterns from cloth and beeswax. They did not rebuild the chapel all at once. They began with the windows, scraping clean the dust, covering the worst gaps with oiled cloth. Then came the roof beams. Castor, the carpenter from Norcaster, arrived after a week, drawn by the word they had sent back. "We don't fix what was," he said, running his hand along the cracked threshold. "We build what's needed now." Sarah opened the first new scroll in Dalewood's name. The villagers watched as she wrote the title across the top. "This is the Book of Light Returned." On the 12th night, they held their own lantern walk. No procession, no songs, just quiet footsteps through the snow, each villager carrying a light. They placed them along the path that led to the woods, not to ward off danger, but to say, "We are here." Briani stood beside Ulrich at the chapel door, watching the lights flicker in the dark. He looked at her. "This is only the first." She nodded, and every step forward leaves something behind to guide the next. They didn't speak again that evening. They simply stood, listening to the snow, to the low hum of life beginning again. And in the morning, they would write a new name at the top of a new page. Snow melted slowly in Dalewood. The lanterns from the 12th night still stood along the forest path, their wax pooled in delicate rings inside the jars. A few had burned out during the dark hours, but many continued to glow faintly, their flames fed by carefully trimmed wicks and the steady hands that lit them. The villagers spoke more openly now. They came not just for food or medicine, but to share what they remembered, recipes, songs, how to mend rope or shape a wooden rake. Their knowledge had not been lost, only buried beneath silence. Brianni sat on the chapel steps each morning, writing with a charcoal stick on scraps of parchment salvaged from the back of the ruined pulpit. She sketched diagrams of what needed repair, what could wait, what must be replaced. Each page she tucked into a growing bundle beside her, tied with twine and marked with her own symbol, an elder leaf. Julien remained close. He had become a familiar figure in the village already, his lanterns now hanging from the eaves of homes that had stood dark for months. He taught the village children how to shape clay into bowls and jars, using the old method Mara had taught him, pressing herbs into the sides before firing to leave faint impressions of rosemary or mint. So food will remember where it came from, he explained. The villagers smiled more now. Ulrich watched from the edges, as he always had, observing without interfering. His journal grew thicker with names, but also with sketches, simple ones, often made in the margins. A woman threading pine needles into a garland, a boy stacking firewood with careful balance, an elder drawing patterns in the snow with his cane. One evening, near the end of their second week, Mara called them together in the square. "There's another village east," she said. "I passed it before the roads froze last year. I remember smoke, but no people. They may be waiting." Brownie looked around the gathered faces. How many here would come with us if we left in spring? Several hands rose. The villagers, who had once spoken in hushed tones and hesitant words, now stood straighter. They asked about wagons, about seeds, about teaching others what they'd learned. No one asked why. They only asked how. That night, Brownie returned to the chapel and found a small bundle placed on the altar. Inside was a stone, smooth, round, dark as ash, and carved into it the image of a single lantern. Below it, in faint script, "To light where there is no map." She closed her hand around the stone and carried it outside. Julien stood by the first lantern he'd placed, now faint and flickering. He looked up when she approached. "It's lasted longer than I thought." "So have we," she replied. He smiled at her, soft, full, without the shadow of what had come before. "Do you think we'll keep going? Even after spring? Even if the next place is harder?" Bryony nodded. "Because of what we carry now." "And what's that?" "Memory. Tools. Seeds." She looked toward the edge of the village, where snow began to thaw beneath the trees. "And each other." The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of pine, distant smoke, and the faint promise of thaw. In the days that followed, the chapel roof was fully patched. A new door was hung. The villagers came each day to help without needing to be asked. The square was swept clean. The bell, long silent, was rehung, though not yet rung. They were saving its sound for something. On the last evening before their party was to return to Norcaster to prepare for spring, Bryony led the villagers through the chapel one last time. It still bore marks of its long abandonment, the stains, the broken pews, the hollow echo in the rear gallery. But the air felt changed, warmer, attentive. She placed the small carved stone on the altar. "This place is not ours," she said, "but we leave a part of ourselves behind." She looked to Ulrich. He stepped forward and opened a fresh page in the second book of the return. With steady hand he wrote, "Dalewood, reclaimed in light," and beneath that the names of those who had stayed. Julien hung one last lantern over the chapel door. It swung in the soft wind, its light catching the frost on the stone step. As they turned toward the road, the villagers followed to the edge of the trees. No farewells, only nods, only light, and somewhere beyond the hills, another village waited. The road back to Norcaster wound like a quiet memory through the bare-limbed trees. The snow had thinned in places, revealing patches of earth dark and rich beneath the melting frost. Where once silence had marked each footfall, now there was the sound of soft conversation, the crunch of boots through slush, and the occasional ring of laughter. It was a returning, but not a retreat. Bryony walked at the head of the group once more, her stride steady, her shawl drawn close against the cold. Beside her, Julien hummed under his breath, a melody from the Day of Lanterns, transformed slightly by time and travel. Behind them trailed Mara, Castor, Sarah, and the others who had gone with them to Dalewood. They carried no spoils, no trophies, only empty jars and clean tools and scrolls filled with names and sketches. The forest opened near midday on the fifth day, and Norcaster came into view like a page turned in a familiar book. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the great elder tree near the chapel stood outlined in frost, its branches bare but unbowed. The city was alive. Bronny paused at the crest of the hill. "It's changed," she said. Julian stepped beside her. "We've changed." They descended together. Word of their return spread quickly. Doors opened. Faces appeared at windows. No bells rang, but the square felt just the same, quiet and curious. Ulrich moved through the crowd. His journal opened once more, noting faces, gestures, names spoken in welcome. A girl handed him a pouch of dried lavender. A boy tugged his sleeve and whispered, "Did the light find them?" Ulrich knelt and answered, "Yes," and they lit it again. Inside the chapel, the hearth had been tended well. Brother Osric rose from his bench with the help of his cane and greeted Bronny with a nod, his eyes scanning the faces behind her. "I see you did not return alone." Bronny shook her head. "We never intended to." That night, they gathered not in solemnity, but in reflection. The central hall was warm with bodies, the air fragrant with rosemary and wood smoke. The people sat in wide circles, lanterns placed on the floor between them like glowing islands of memory. Brianni stepped into the center. "Dalewood stands," she said. "The chapel is whole, the people remember, and they are ready to begin again as we did." She gestured to Sarah, who unrolled one of her scrolls, filled with diagrams, maps, notes on soil and sickness, songs sung by the children in that snow-covered square. "We've started a second archive," Brianni continued, "not just of names, but of places reborn. And we are not done." There was no applause, only the flickering of lantern light across attentive faces. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of breath held in reverence. Julien stood next. He held a simple lantern in his hands, one with a new symbol carved into the base. Two trees side by side, roots intertwined. "I'm not a child anymore," he said, voice clear. "But I still carry what I was, what I lost, what I found, and what I learned." He looked toward Brianni, then Mara, then Ulrich. "And I want to keep walking." That night, plans formed gently like frost blooming on window panes. 3 groups would leave in spring, one to a valley near the old mines, another to a coastal town where trade had vanished, and a third to a river village long believed deserted. Volunteers stepped forward quietly, each marking their name in the new journal with their own hand. No one was pressed. No one was hurried. Brianni sat by the hearth with Ulrich as the room emptied. "We began this thinking we were tending to loss," she said softly. "And instead?" he asked. She looked at the pages filled with names, the lanterns glowing like stars around them. "We were tending to light." Outside, snow began to fall again, but gently, like a curtain drawn not to hide, but to soften. And within the chapel, where once there had been only silence, now there was the sound of pages turning, tools being packed, and the low murmur of those preparing not to flee from ruin, but to carry hope into its hallowed places. The road back to Norcaster wound like a quiet memory through the bare-limbed trees. The snow had thinned in places, revealing patches of earth dark and rich beneath the melting frost. Where once silence had marked each footfall, now there was the sound of soft conversation, the crunch of boots through slush, and the occasional ring of laughter. It was a returning, but not a retreat. Brianni walked at the head of the group once more, her stride steady, her shawl drawn close against the cold. Beside her, Yulin hummed under his breath, a melody from the Day of Lanterns, transformed slightly by time and travel. Behind them trailed Mara, Castor, Sarah, and the others who had gone with them to Dalewood. They carried no spoils, no trophies, only empty jars and clean tools and scrolls filled with names and sketches. The forest opened near midday on the 5th day, and Norcaster came into view like a page turned in a familiar book. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the great elder tree near the chapel stood outlined in frost, its branches bare but unbowed. The city was alive. Brianni paused at the crest of the hill. "It's changed," she said. Julien stepped beside her. "We've changed." They descended together. Word of their return spread quickly. Doors opened. Faces appeared at windows. No bells rang, but the square felt just the same, quiet and curious. Ulrich moved through the crowd, his journal open once more, noting faces, gestures, names spoken in welcome. A girl handed him a pouch of dried lavender. A boy tugged his sleeve and whispered, "Did the light find them?" Ulrich knelt and answered, "Yes," and they lit it again. Inside the chapel, the hearth had been tended well. Brother Osric rose from his bench with the help of his cane and greeted Bryony with a nod, his eyes scanning the faces behind her. "I see you did not return alone." Bryony shook her head. "We never intended to." That night they gathered not in solemnity, but in reflection. The central hall was warm with bodies, the air fragrant with rosemary and wood smoke. The people sat in wide circles, lanterns placed on the floor between them like glowing islands of memory. Bryony stepped into the center. "Dalewood stands," she said. "The chapel is whole, the people remember, and they are ready to begin again, as we did." She gestured to Sarah, who unrolled one of her scrolls, filled with diagrams, maps, notes on sickness, songs sung by the children in that snow-covered square. "We've started a second archive," Bryony continued. "Not just of names, but of places reborn, and we are not done." There was no applause, only the flickering of lantern light across attentive faces. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of breath held in reverence. Julien stood next. He held a simple lantern in his hands, one with a new symbol carved into the base, two trees side by side, roots intertwined. "I'm not a child anymore," he said, voice clear. "But I still carry what I was, what I lost, what I found, and what I learned." He looked toward Bryony, then Mara, then Ulrich, "And I want to keep walking." That night, plans formed gently, like frost blooming on window panes. 3 groups would leave in spring, one to a valley near the old mines, another to a coastal town where trade had vanished, and a third to a river village long believed deserted. Volunteers stepped forward quietly, each marking their name in the new journal with their own hand. No one was pressed. No one was hurried. Bryony sat by the hearth with Ulrich as the room emptied. "We began this thinking we were tending to loss," she said softly. "And instead," he asked. She looked at the pages filled with names, the lanterns glowing like stars around them. "We were tending to light." Outside, snow began to fall again, but gently, like a curtain drawn not to hide, but to soften. And within the chapel, where once there had been only silence, now there was the sound of pages turning, tools being packed, and the low murmur of those preparing not to flee from ruin, but to carry hope into its hallowed places. The last frost came with little warning. It blanketed the garden in Norcaster one final time, coating the early crocus buds in delicate ice, and dusting the stone steps of the chapel in white. By mid-morning, it had begun to melt, trickling down gutters and soaking into the earth like a quiet farewell. Winter, once so heavy and relentless, had softened into memory. The season had turned. Inside the chapel, the halls were filled with light. Lanterns, freshly cleaned and trimmed, hung from every archway, their glass polished to a gentle gleam. The benches were dusted, the floors swept, and the hearths burned low and steady. There was no ceremony planned for this day, no festival or ringing of bells, but everyone in Norcaster knew it was time. Bryony stood in the garden beneath the elder tree, her fingers trailing across the bark. The tree had not bloomed yet, but she could feel the life within it, quiet and waiting. Behind her, the first of the spring groups were preparing to depart. Their carts were packed, their boots laced, their lanterns wrapped in cloth. Julien approached, a satchel over his shoulder and a wide-brimmed hat on his head. He looked taller than ever, his face marked with the fine traces of a young man beginning to outgrow the shadow of the past. "I've packed the seeds," he said. "Sage, rosemary, wild mint, and the drawings." Bryony smiled. "Don't forget the stories. They're written in the scrolls." "Not those," she said. "The ones you tell, the ones you carry." Julien nodded. "I'll remember." Mara arrived next, her cart already filled with jars, bundles of cloth, and a small crate of hand tools. She wore her old green cloak, the one she'd arrived in so many months ago, now patched and faded but still strong. "They're ready," she said simply. Bryony turned to Ulrich, who stood near the chapel doorway, his leather-bound journal in hand. He was not going with them, not this time. He would stay, for now, to teach the new scribes, to tend the archives, and to prepare for the paths yet to be walked. He stepped forward, opened the journal to the last page, and wrote in slow, careful script, "Spring, the first great departure. Beneath it, he listed each name, each destination, each bundle carried. He handed the pen to Brioni, and she added a single line beneath them all. May the light walk beside you, and the roots remember your name. They embraced, not tightly, but with the stillness that comes from shared purpose. Then Brioni turned to the group assembled at the chapel gates. There were no speeches, only quiet glances, the sound of wind through waking trees, and the first bird song of the season. One by one, the lanterns were lifted, uncovered, and lit. The procession began down the eastern road, past the edge of the garden, past the place where the burial fields had once stretched silent and unmarked. Now the grass had returned, and small stones etched with names caught the morning light like scattered stars. Brioni did not look back. She walked steadily, the lantern swinging at her side, the path opening gently before her like a page waiting to be written. Beside her, Julian walked in silence, his satchel bouncing lightly with each step. Behind them, Mara hummed a tune under her breath, one that had no words but carried with it a shape older than sorrow. By midday, they reached the edge of Norcaster's hills. There they paused. Brioni turned once, looking at the city in the distance, its chapel spire, its rooftops glinting with thaw, its garden already greening with the promise of another spring. Let it be known, she whispered. Then she turned back to the road ahead, the first of many. Not a journey of wandering, but of planting, of returning, of light carried into every corner where silence once reigned. And so they walked onward,